There is a violence in sudden awakening that the soul was never meant to endure. When consciousness tears through the veil of sleep too swiftly, too completely, it leaves the psyche bleeding in places that have no names. The gentle dawn that should have arrived in whispers instead crashes like thunder through chambers of the heart that were meant to open slowly, petal by petal, breath by breath. You know this violence if you have lived it. It is the moment when the familiar world, the world of predictable sorrows and comfortable illusions, suddenly becomes transparent as glass, and behind it blazes a light so fierce that your eyes, accustomed to shadow, cannot bear to look directly. Yet look you must, for once the veil is torn, there is no mending it. The soul finds itself naked before infinity, shivering in its own inadequacy. In the psychology of the depths, we speak of individuation as a process, a gradual unfolding that honors both the darkness and the light within. But what happens when this process is accelerated beyond the soul's capacity to integrate? What becomes of the psyche when it is thrust from its chrysalis before its wings have formed? The result is neither death nor birth, but a terrible suspension between worlds, a liminal anguish that leaves one belonging fully to neither the darkness behind nor the light ahead. The ego, that faithful servant of consciousness, that brave, little sentinel standing guard at the gates of awareness, suddenly finds itself overwhelmed by forces it was never trained to meet. For so long, it has been the sovereign of its small kingdom, making decisions, forming judgments, maintaining the illusion of control over the narrow realm of personal identity. The ego knows its boundaries, takes pride in its competence, finds security in its limitations. It is the part of us that says, "I am this, not that," and draws the careful lines that separate self from other, known from unknown, acceptable from forbidden. But in the moment of violent awakening, these boundaries dissolve like salt in water. The unconscious, that vast ocean of potentiality that Jung knew to be both creative matrix and devouring mother, suddenly floods through every crack in the ego's carefully constructed fortress. What was once solid becomes fluid. What was once separate becomes connected. What was once controllable becomes wildly, terrifyingly autonomous. The individual experiences this as a kind of psychological earthquake, where the very ground of being shifts beneath their feet. One moment they are walking on familiar terrain, secure in their understanding of who they are and how the world works, and the next moment they are falling through space, grasping for handholds that dissolve at their touch. The personality structures that once felt as solid as stone reveal themselves to be as insubstantial as morning mist. This is not the gentle awakening that spiritual traditions speak of in their idealized accounts. This is not the gradual dawn of enlightenment that unfolds like a flower in spring sunshine. This is the violent rupture that occurs when the psyche's natural timing is violated, when consciousness is forced to expand beyond its current capacity to contain and integrate new levels of awareness. The symptoms of this violation are unmistakable to those who have eyes to see. There is a quality of rawness, of exposure, as if the soul's skin has been peeled away, leaving every nerve ending open to sensations it cannot yet comprehend. Colors become too bright, sounds too sharp, emotions too intense. The ordinary world takes on an otherworldly quality, as if one is seeing it through a lens that reveals both its profound beauty and its essential emptiness simultaneously. Sleep becomes elusive, not because the body is not tired, but because consciousness fears to let go its precarious grip on this new reality. Dreams, when they come, are vast and overwhelming, filled with symbols and archetypes that pour through the psyche like a river in flood. The dreamer awakens more exhausted than before, having spent the night in territories of the soul that require a kind of attention the ego has not yet learned to give. Relationships become suddenly problematic, not because others have changed, but because the individual can no longer relate to them from the old, familiar patterns. The persona, that social mask Jung understood to be both necessary protection and potential prison, begins to feel like an ill-fitting costume. Friends and family members seem to be speaking a language that no longer resonates, discussing concerns that feel trivial in the face of the vast questions that now consume the inner landscape. There is a profound loneliness in this experience, for who can understand the one who has been thrust into territories of consciousness that most will never visit? The individual finds themselves unable to speak of what they have seen, not because it is forbidden, but because the language itself seems inadequate to convey the reality of their experience. They become strangers in their own life, observers of a world they once fully inhabited. Yet within this violence, within this terrible disruption of the psyche's natural order, lies a seed of genuine transformation. Jung knew that individuation, the process by which one becomes who one truly is, cannot occur without the dissolution of false structures. The ego must die before the self can be born. The persona must crack before authentic personality can emerge. The familiar must become unfamiliar before the genuinely new can manifest. The tragedy of violent awakening is not that it destroys. Destruction is often necessary for true growth, but that it destroys without the accompanying wisdom to rebuild. The psyche finds itself in a state of creative chaos, without the tools to give form to what is being created. It is like being given the fire of the gods without first learning the craft of the blacksmith. The flame burns, but what it creates is often twisted, incomplete, or dangerous. In the depths of this confusion, the individual may experience what Jung called the transcendent function, that mysterious psychological process by which opposing forces within the psyche begin to generate new possibilities. But when this function is activated too rapidly, before the ego has developed sufficient strength and flexibility, it can feel more like being torn apart than being made whole. The synthesis that should bring integration instead brings fragmentation. The unconscious, normally a wellspring of creativity and renewal, becomes in these circumstances more like a breached dam, flooding the conscious mind with contents it cannot yet assimilate. Archetypal energies that should emerge gradually, allowing the ego time to establish relationship with them, instead erupt with overwhelming force. The individual may find themselves possessed by qualities they do not recognize, driven by impulses they cannot understand, speaking truths they have not yet learned. This is perhaps the cruelest aspect of violent awakening, that it shows the individual visions of their potential transformation, while simultaneously making that transformation feel impossible to achieve. They see the mountaintop but find themselves lost in avalanche-prone terrain with no map, no guide, and no climbing equipment. The vision becomes not inspiration, but torment, not promise, but accusation. And yet, even in the midst of this chaos, the deeper wisdom of the psyche is at work. What appears to be destruction may be a necessary clearing away of false structures. What feels like madness may be the breakthrough of authentic creativity. What seems like the end of the world may be the difficult birth of a new one. The violence of awakening, though traumatic in the moment, may serve the deeper purpose of shattering illusions that could never have been gently dissolved. The key lies not in avoiding this violence. For some souls, it seems to be their inevitable path, but in learning to work with it skillfully. This requires a fundamental shift in perspective, from seeing awakening as something that happens to us, to understanding it as something we must actively participate in creating. The individual must become both patient and practitioner of their own transformation, both the raw material and the artist who shapes it. In the depth psychology that Jung pioneered, we understand that the psyche contains its own healing wisdom, its own capacity for self-regulation and growth. But this wisdom requires time to operate, space to unfold, and most importantly, conscious cooperation from the ego. When awakening comes too swiftly, the ego must learn new skills almost instantaneously, skills of surrender without collapse, of openness without dissolution, of strength without rigidity. This is the paradox of violent awakening. It demands of us capacities we do not yet possess, while simultaneously making their development urgent. We must learn to swim while drowning, to build while being demolished, to integrate while fragmenting. It is a task that seems impossible, and perhaps it is for the ego that attempts it. But for the deeper self, that transcendent organizing principle that Jung saw as the true center of the personality, no task is impossible, only difficult. The violent dawn that shatters the familiar world is also the violent dawn that makes the truly new possible. In the ruins of the old self lies the raw material for a more authentic existence. In the chaos of disrupted patterns lies the space for genuine creativity to emerge. In the pain of broken illusions lies the invitation to discover what is real. But this discovery cannot be forced or hurried. The soul that has been violently awakened must learn a new relationship with time, must develop what we might call sacred patience, not the passive waiting that avoids action, but the active receptivity that allows the deeper processes of transformation to unfold in their own timing. This is perhaps the most difficult lesson of all, for the very urgency that characterizes violent awakening makes patience feel like betrayal. Yet patience is not betrayal, but wisdom. The psyche that has been broken open needs time to heal, not in the sense of returning to its former state, but in the deeper sense of learning to inhabit its new configuration. The consciousness that has been flooded with light needs time to develop the capacity to hold that light without being blinded by it. The ego that has been dethroned needs time to find its proper role in service of the greater self. As we stand at the threshold of this exploration, witnessing the aftermath of violent awakening, we must remember that no experience in the depths of the psyche is without meaning. Even the most chaotic, the most painful, the most destructive experiences serve the deeper purpose of individuation, though that purpose may not be apparent for years or even decades. The violent dawn that seems to destroy everything may be clearing the ground for something more beautiful than anything that came before. But first, before that beauty can emerge, there must be a patient engagement with the dissolution that follows in the wake of violent awakening. The familiar self, having been shattered by premature light, must be allowed to dissolve completely before the authentic self can begin to crystallize. This dissolution is the subject of our next movement in this symphony of transformation, for it is only by understanding how the old self dies that we can begin to comprehend how the new self is born. In the aftermath of violent awakening, when the dust of shattered certainties has begun to settle, the soul discovers itself in a landscape that defies all previous mapping. Here, in this liminal territory between what was and what might be, begins the most profound dissolution the human psyche can undergo. Not the dissolution of the body, which is merely death, but the dissolution of the very sense of self that has carried one through decades of existence. The familiar self, that composite of memories, beliefs, preferences, and identities that we have mistaken for our essential being, begins to reveal its true nature. Like ancient parchment exposed to sudden light, it starts to crumble at the edges, its carefully inscribed certainties fading into illegibility. What we thought was permanent proves to be temporary. What we believed was solid proves to be constructed. From the most ephemeral materials, this dissolution does not announce itself with fanfare. There is no moment when one can point and say, "Here now, I am ceasing to be who I was." Instead, it seeps through the foundations of identity like groundwater through limestone, slowly, inexorably, until one day the individual looks in the eye, mirror of self-reflection, and finds a stranger looking back. The face is the same, the body unchanged, but the presence that inhabits them has become mysteriously altered, as if viewed through water that has not yet settled. Jung understood the persona as that necessary mask we wear for the world, the socially acceptable face we present in our various roles as parent, professional, friend, citizen. The persona is not false in the sense of being deliberately deceptive, but it is partial, a selection from the vast symphony of our potential selves, single melody lifted from an infinite composition. In ordinary consciousness, we often mistake this melody for the entire song, this mask for the face beneath. But in the dissolution that follows violent awakening, the persona begins to feel like an ill-fitting garment, something borrowed from a stranger's closet. The roles that once felt natural become performances that require conscious effort. The individual finds themselves going through the motions of their established identity while feeling increasingly disconnected from the one who performs these actions. It is as if they are watching themselves from a great distance, observing a character in a play they no longer remember agreeing to act in. The mother discovers that the maternal feelings she once took for granted now feel hollow, performed rather than felt. The successful professional finds that achievements that once brought satisfaction now taste like ash in their mouth. The devoted spouse realizes that the love they thought was unconditional was perhaps more conditional than they could bear to acknowledge. These recognitions arrive not as accusations but as simple, terrible facts that cannot be argued with or explained away. This is not to say that these roles were entirely false or that the feelings associated with them were mere pretense. Rather, it is that they were partial truths, fragments of a larger reality that was kept hidden even from the one who lived it. The dissolution reveals not the falseness of what was, but the incompleteness, the way that identifying with any single aspect of ourselves necessarily excludes the recognition of all other aspects. In this revelation lies both terror and liberation. Terror, because if we are not who we thought we were, then who are we? If the ground of our identity has been built on shifting sand, where can we stand with confidence? The ego, already wounded by the violent awakening, now finds itself without the familiar landmarks that once provided orientation. It is like being lost in a forest where even the trees one thought one recognized have somehow changed their shapes. But there is also liberation in this dissolution, though it may take months or years before this aspect becomes apparent. For, if the familiar self was never our true self, then its dissolution frees us from a prison we did not know we inhabited. If the persona was a mask, then its removal allows authentic features to emerge. If the roles were performances, then their end permits the spontaneous expression of qualities that have been waiting in the wings of consciousness for their moment to appear. The process of this dissolution follows patterns that Jung observed in his study of the alchemical tradition. Like the medieval alchemist who began the great work by dissolving base metals in acid, the psyche must first break down existing structures before new ones can be synthesized. The Latin term, solve et coagula, dissolve and coagulate, captures this essential rhythm of psychological transformation. First the breaking apart, then the coming together in new form. But the individual undergoing this process is not a detached observer conducting an experiment in a laboratory. They are both the alchemist and the raw material, both the one who dissolves and the one who is dissolved. This dual nature creates a unique form of suffering, for consciousness must witness its own dissolution without the comfort of maintaining distance from the process. The ego watches itself die, experiences its own death, while somehow continuing to exist as the witness of this death. In the early stages of dissolution, the individual may experience what feels like a gradual amnesia of the soul. Memories that once seemed significant fade into irrelevance. Preferences that once felt strong become matters of indifference. The very sense of having a coherent personal history begins to weaken, as if the thread that connects past to present to future has been cut, leaving only disconnected beads rolling across the floor of consciousness. This amnesia is not pathological in the medical sense, though it may sometimes resemble certain clinical conditions. Rather, it is a natural response of the psyche to information and structures that no longer serve its deeper purposes. Just as the body naturally sloughs off dead cells to make room for new growth, the soul begins to release attachment to aspects of identity that have outlived their usefulness. The beliefs that once provided scaffolding for meaning collapse one by one, not through intellectual argument or philosophical persuasion, but through a simple loss of feeling connection. The individual may find themselves unable to remember why they once cared so passionately about causes that now seem remote and abstract. Political affiliations that once felt like matters of life and death become curious relics of a former self. Religious convictions that once burned with certainty cool to lukewarm questions that seem hardly worth pursuing. This is perhaps one of the most disorienting aspects of the dissolution process, the way that passion itself seems to drain from life, leaving behind a strange emotional flatland where nothing quite reaches the level of genuine caring. It is not depression in the clinical sense, for there is no pervasive sadness or sense of hopelessness. Rather, it is a kind of neutral suspension, a holding pattern of the heart that neither embraces nor rejects, but simply observes with detached curiosity. Friends and family members often find this phase of dissolution deeply troubling, for they are confronted with someone who looks familiar but responds unfamiliarly. The person they knew seems to have disappeared, replaced by someone who is pleasant enough but somehow absent, like a photograph that has been perfectly reproduced but has lost its original vibrancy. Conversations that once flowed naturally now feel forced and artificial. Shared interests that once created connection now reveal themselves as superficial bonds that cannot bridge the growing chasm of different realities. The individual undergoing dissolution often feels guilty about this emotional absence, interpreting it as a failure of love or commitment rather than recognizing it as a natural stage in a deeper process. They may try to force feeling where none exists, to perform the emotions they believe they should have, only to discover that such performance feels even more false than honest emptiness. This guilt compounds the disorientation, creating layers of confusion about what is natural and what is pathological in their experience. As the dissolution deepens, even the sense of personal agency begins to weaken. Decisions that once felt clearly theirs now seem to emerge from nowhere in particular, as if choices were being made by some part of themselves they do not recognize. The familiar sense of being the author of one's life gives way to the strange experience of being a character in a story whose plot has become incomprehensible. Actions happen through them rather than being initiated by them. This loss of agency is particularly troubling for individuals who have been accustomed to feeling in control of their lives. The ego, which has built its sense of security on the illusion that it directs the show of personality, suddenly finds itself reduced to a confused observer of processes it neither understands nor can influence. It is like being a passenger in a vehicle whose driver has become invisible, traveling on roads that do not appear on any map toward a destination that has not been announced. Yet within this apparent loss of control lies the beginning of a different kind of freedom. When the ego's grip on experience loosens, space opens for spontaneous emergence of qualities that were previously held in check by conscious intention. Creativity may flower in unexpected ways. Intuition may begin to operate with uncanny accuracy. Compassion may arise naturally toward people who were previously seen as difficult or unpleasant. It is as if the dissolution of the controlling ego allows the deeper wisdom of the psyche to express itself more directly. The individual may begin to notice that while they feel less in control of their external life, they are somehow more authentic in their responses to it. Without the familiar filters of persona and social expectation, their reactions become more immediate, more genuine, more surprising even to themselves. They may discover reserves of courage they did not know they possessed, or find themselves speaking truths they had not consciously formulated. This authenticity, however, comes at the cost of predictability. The individual can no longer count on responding to situations in their habitual ways. Social interactions become experimental rather than routine. Professional responsibilities require constant improvisation rather than relying on established patterns. Even intimate relationships must be negotiated anew, as if meeting one's spouse or children for the first time. The dissolution of familiar self extends even to the body's sense of itself in space and time. The individual may experience periods where their physical boundaries feel unclear, where the distinction between self and environment becomes fuzzy. They may feel simultaneously too large for their skin and too small for the space they occupy. Time itself may seem to move differently, with hours passing like minutes and minutes stretching like hours. Sleep patterns often become irregular during this phase, not from anxiety or excitement, but from a fundamental shift in the circadian rhythms of consciousness itself. The individual may find themselves naturally awake during hours they once slept and drowsy during their former periods of peak alertness. Dreams, when they come, often feature landscapes that bear no resemblance to any place they have ever been, populated by figures who seem familiar yet unidentifiable. These physical and temporal dislocations are not merely side effects of psychological change, but integral aspects of the dissolution process. The familiar self was not just a collection of mental concepts, but an embodied reality, a way of inhabiting space and time that gave structure to experience. As this way of being dissolves, the body must learn new patterns of existence, must discover how to be present in reality without the old frameworks that once made presence possible. In the depth psychology tradition, this phase of dissolution is recognized as a necessary death that precedes rebirth. The alchemists called it the nigredo, the blackening, the stage where all previous forms must be reduced to their prime matter before new creation can begin. In the great mythologies of the world, it appears as the hero's descent into the underworld, the period of wandering in the wilderness, the dark night of the soul that tests every assumption about what it means to be human. But knowing that this dissolution serves a larger purpose does not make living through it any easier. The individual caught in its grip cannot see the destination toward which it leads, cannot even be certain that there is a destination. They must surrender to a process whose outcome is unknown, must trust a wisdom they cannot yet comprehend, must have faith in a future self they cannot imagine. This surrender is perhaps the most difficult task the human ego can undertake, for it requires the voluntary relinquishment of the very control that the ego exists to maintain. It asks the part of us that says I to step aside and allow something larger to operate through us. It demands that we become empty so that we might be filled, that we become nothing so that we might become everything. The familiar self dies, reluctantly, fighting for its existence even as it recognizes the futility of resistance. Like autumn leaves that cling to branches long after their chlorophyll has faded, the old patterns of identity persist through habit and momentum even when their living connection to the source has been severed. The individual may find themselves cycling through personas like costumes in a theatrical wardrobe, trying on different identities to see if any still fit, only to discover that they have outgrown them all. In this cycling lies both torment and comedy. The person who was once decisive becomes confused about the simplest choices. The one who was once certain becomes riddled with doubt. The one who was once passionate becomes coolly analytical. It is as if the psyche is experimenting with different possibilities, trying to discover what remains constant when all variables are changed. What remains, of course, is the witness, that quality of awareness that observes all these changes without itself being changed by them. But this witness is not yet recognized as the true self, for it seems too empty, too undefined, too lacking in the familiar markers of personal identity. The ego, accustomed to defining itself through its contents, cannot initially recognize the validity of a selfhood that consists primarily of conscious space rather than conscious stuff. As the dissolution progresses toward its completion, the individual begins to experience moments of profound stillness, gaps in the constant mental commentary that once provided the illusion of continuous selfhood. In these gaps, something else is present, not another personality or identity, but a quality of being that is both utterly intimate and mysteriously impersonal. It is like discovering a room in one's house that was always there but somehow remained, unnoticed until this moment. These moments of stillness are often accompanied by an inexplicable sense of homecoming, as if the individual has been wandering in foreign countries and has suddenly recognized the landscape of their birthplace. Yet this homecoming is not a return to any previous state, but an arrival at something entirely new, or perhaps entirely ancient, so ancient that it predates the formation of the familiar self that has been dissolving. In the final stages of dissolution, what Jung called the transcendent function begins to operate more clearly. This mysterious psychological process, by which opposing forces within the psyche generate new possibilities, starts to point toward configurations of selfhood that transcend the limitations of what came before. The individual begins to sense, if not yet understand, that their dissolution is not an end, but a beginning, not a loss, but a transformation into something more authentic than anything they have previously known. But this sensing comes wrapped in paradox, for the more clearly they perceive the possibility of authentic selfhood, the more completely they must surrender any attempt to control or direct its emergence. The familiar self must die completely before the authentic self can be born, and this death cannot be hurried, cannot be bypassed, cannot be made comfortable through any strategy of the ego, and so the dissolution continues its patient work, dissolving not only the false, but also the partial truths that once seemed so complete, not only the masks, but also the face that thought it was hiding behind them, not only the roles, but also the player who thought she was performing them. In this complete dissolution lies the preparation for what is to come, the confrontation with the shadow that can no longer be avoided when all the familiar defenses have been worn away. The soul, naked now of its accustomed garments, must face what it has spent a lifetime avoiding. The shadow, no longer held at bay by the structures of familiar selfhood, begins to rise from the depths where it has been imprisoned, bringing with it all the dark gifts that the ego was never strong enough to receive. This confrontation, premature and unprepared, becomes the next movement in the symphony of violent awakening, a movement that will test whether the dissolution of the familiar self has created space for integration or merely for chaos. When the familiar guardians of consciousness have been swept away by the dissolution of the constructed self, the soul finds itself defenseless before forces it was never meant to meet unprepared. The shadow, that vast repository of everything we have rejected, denied, and cast into the darkness of the unconscious, senses the vacuum left by the ego's weakening and begins its inexorable rise toward the surface of awareness. This meeting, which should unfold gradually over years of careful inner work, instead erupts like a geyser of dark water, flooding the unprepared psyche with contents it lacks the strength to contain. Jung understood the shadow not as evil in any absolute sense, but as the unlived life, the road not taken, the aspects of personality that were sacrificed in service of adaptation and social acceptance. In every choice to be kind, there lives an unchosen capacity for cruelty. In every decision to be responsible, there dwells a rejected impulse toward abandon. In every commitment to truth, there hides a disowned talent for deception. These rejected qualities do not disappear when we turn away from them. Instead, they gather in the unconscious depths like sediment at the bottom of a lake, waiting for the right conditions to rise again to the surface. Under normal circumstances, the encounter with one's shadow unfolds through the gradual recognition of projections, those moments when we find ourselves inexplicably irritated by qualities in others that we fail to recognize in ourselves. The meticulous person becomes enraged by messiness in their environment, not recognizing their own chaotic impulses. The generous individual finds themselves disgusted by greed in others, blind to their own acquisitive desires. Through such projections, the psyche slowly, safely, allows shadow contents to emerge into consciousness where they can be examined, understood, and eventually integrated. But in the aftermath of violent awakening, when the ego's defenses have been shattered and the familiar self has dissolved, this gradual process of recognition and integration is bypassed entirely. The shadow does not emerge through projection onto external figures, but erupts directly into consciousness like oil. Bursting from an untapped well, the individual suddenly finds themselves face to face with aspects of their nature they never suspected existed, impulses they never imagined they could harbor, capacities for both creation and destruction that dwarf anything their previous self-understanding could accommodate. This premature embrace of the shadow carries with it a quality of overwhelming immediacy that can be mistaken for madness. The individual may find themselves suddenly flooded with violent fantasies that seem to emerge from nowhere. The gentlest soul discovers murderous impulses coursing through their awareness. The most ethical person finds themselves contemplating elaborate schemes of deception and manipulation. The devoted partner experiences waves of sexual desire for inappropriate others. These emergent contents feel so foreign to the familiar self that they seem like invasions from an alien intelligence. The terror of this experience cannot be overstated, for it calls into question everything the individual believed about their fundamental nature. If I am capable of these thoughts, these feelings, these impulses, the soul asks, then who am I really? If these dark possibilities live within me, waiting only for the right conditions to emerge, then what does that say about the goodness I thought was my essential quality? The moral foundations upon which identity was built begin to crack under the weight of shadow recognition. Yet the shadow's embrace brings more than violent or antisocial impulses. Often, the qualities that emerge are not evil but simply vital, in ways that the constructed self was too refined, too civilized, too spiritualized to allow. The individual may discover reserves of raw sexuality that their previous persona could never express. They may find themselves drawn to experiences of primitive intensity, loud music, physical risk, emotional extremes that their former self would have judged as crude or undeveloped. There is often a quality of hunger in these shadow encounters, as if parts of the personality that have been starved for decades suddenly discover nourishment within reach. The person who has lived a life of careful restraint may find themselves craving excess in all its forms. The one who has maintained rigid self-control may experience an almost desperate need for abandon. The individual who has prided themselves on rationality may be overwhelmed by tides of irrational feeling that seem to possess their own intelligence. This hunger can manifest in compulsive behaviors that feel simultaneously foreign and familiar. The person finds themselves engaging in actions they would have previously found inconceivable, staying out all night in questionable company, spending money recklessly, pursuing relationships that violate their stated values, expressing anger with a ferocity that surprises everyone who thought they knew them. These behaviors are not chosen in the ordinary sense, but seem to choose themselves, emerging from depths the conscious mind cannot access or control. The family and friends of someone undergoing shadow embrace often find themselves confronting what seems like a completely different person. The mild-mannered individual becomes explosive. The responsible citizen becomes recklessly impulsive. The devoted spouse becomes mysteriously absent. These changes are not gradual adaptations, but sudden reversals that seem to violate everything that was previously predictable about the person's character. From the outside, such transformations can look like midlife crisis, nervous breakdown, or moral collapse. Those who love the individual may try to call them back to their real self, not understanding that what they are witnessing is precisely the emergence of aspects of the real self that were previously hidden. Well-meaning interventions aimed at restoring the familiar persona often intensify the shadow's rebellion, for they represent attempts to reimpose the very constraints that the psyche is desperately trying to transcend. The individual caught in shadow embrace faces an impossible dilemma. To resist these emerging impulses feels like violence against newly discovered aspects of their own nature. Yet to act upon them often violates every moral principle they have previously held sacred and risks destroying relationships and circumstances that still hold genuine meaning. They find themselves caught between betraying who they were and betraying who they are becoming, with no clear path that honors both realities. This internal conflict creates a state of moral vertigo that can be more disorienting than any external crisis. The ethical frameworks that once provided clear guidance become irrelevant when the very nature of the self that must make ethical choices has become unclear. Traditional concepts of right and wrong presuppose a consistent self that can be held accountable for its actions, but what accountability is possible when the self that makes a choice in the morning may be fundamentally different from the self that must live with the consequences in the evening? In the depths of shadow embrace, the individual often experiences what can only be described as a kind of possession. They feel driven by forces that seem to operate independently of their conscious will, compelled to speak words they had not planned to say, to make choices they had not intended to make, to become someone they had not chosen to become. This possession is not the dramatic affair depicted in horror films, but a subtle overtaking that feels like discovering that one's own body is being operated by a stranger. Jung observed that what we resist in ourselves gains power over us, while what we consciously acknowledge and engage with can be transformed into ally rather than enemy. But this wisdom assumes a strong enough ego structure to maintain conscious relationship with shadow contents as they emerge. When the shadow erupts into a psyche whose defenses have been shattered by violent awakening, such conscious engagement becomes nearly impossible. The individual is overwhelmed by forces they lack the psychological tools to understand or direct. The shadow's premature embrace often manifests first in the realm of fantasy and dream before erupting into actual behavior. The individual may find themselves consumed by elaborate imaginings of scenarios they would never want to enact in reality, detailed fantasies of revenge against those who have hurt them, elaborate sexual scenarios involving inappropriate partners, or grandiose visions of power and domination over others. These fantasies feel simultaneously repugnant and compelling, as if they were being projected into consciousness by some alien intelligence. When such fantasies begin to translate into action, they often do so in ways that seem designed to create maximum disruption in the individual's life. It is as if the shadow, having been denied expression for so long, is determined to make up for lost time by cramming decades of unlived experience into a few months or years. The result is often a period of apparent self-destruction that looks like suicide by installment, the systematic dismantling of everything the familiar self worked to create. Career suicide becomes common during intense shadow embrace, as the Individual finds themselves unable or unwilling to maintain the professional persona that their work requires. They may become insubordinate to authority figures who previously commanded their respect, or find themselves drawn to express opinions that violate the unspoken codes of their profession. The lawyer becomes fascinated with moral ambiguity. The therapist becomes judgmental. The spiritual teacher becomes materialistic. These reversals are not strategic choices, but compulsive expressions of long-suppressed aspects of personality. Relationships, too, often become casualties of shadow embrace, though not always in the ways one might expect. Sometimes, the individual becomes cruel to those they love, as if testing whether affection can survive the revelation of their darker nature. Other times, they become indiscriminately generous with their attention and affection, unable to maintain appropriate boundaries with acquaintances while withdrawing from intimate connections. The familiar patterns of love and loyalty dissolve into experimental configurations that confuse everyone involved. Sexual shadow material often emerges with particular intensity during this phase, bringing with it desires and preferences that may contradict everything the individual previously believed about their erotic nature. The person who thought they were naturally monogamous discovers powerful urges toward promiscuity. The one who believed themselves conventionally oriented finds themselves drawn to experiences that challenge every assumption about their sexual identity. These discoveries can be liberating for some and terrifying for others, but they are rarely neutral. The spiritual seeker who has tried to transcend the body often finds themselves plunged into intense preoccupation with physical sensation and material pleasure. Food becomes a source of almost mystical satisfaction. Physical comfort becomes a craving that demands constant attention. The body, so long denied its full expression, suddenly asserts its claims with overwhelming intensity. This can manifest as gluttony, promiscuity, or simply an insatiable desire for physical experience of all kinds. Anger, perhaps more than any other shadow quality, erupts with volcanic force in those who have spent years cultivating patience and understanding. The spiritual practitioner, who has meditated for decades on loving kindness, may find themselves consumed with rage so pure and focused, it feels like a spiritual experience in itself. This anger often carries with it a quality of righteousness that makes it feel not only justified but sacred, as if it were the very wrath of God expressing itself through human form. This sanctified anger can be particularly dangerous because it comes wrapped in apparent spiritual authority. The individual experiencing it may feel called to become an instrument of divine justice, correcting wrongs and punishing evildoers with a certainty that brooks no questioning. They may begin to see enemies everywhere, people who need to be confronted, systems that need to be challenged, injustices that demand their personal intervention. The modest ego that once doubted itself becomes inflated with messianic purpose. The premature embrace of shadow material often triggers what Jung called enantiodromia, the psychological law by which things transform into their opposites when pushed to extremes. The person who was excessively humble becomes grandiose. The one who was overly controlled becomes chaotic. The individual who was too trusting becomes paranoid. These reversals are not moderate corrections, but wild swings of the psychological pendulum that can shatter everything in their path. In the midst of such chaos, the individual often experiences moments of crystalline clarity about the nature of their previous life. They see with devastating accuracy how much of what they called love was actually need, how much of what they called wisdom was actually fear, how much of what they called virtue was actually the avoidance of authentic engagement with life's full spectrum of possibility. These recognitions, while ultimately valuable, arrive with such force that they can temporarily destroy the capacity for any kind of self-respect or confidence. The shadow's embrace also brings gifts that the conscious mind is often too overwhelmed to recognize. Creativity may explode in unexpected directions as previous Forbidden aspects of personality find expression through art, writing, or other forms of imaginative work. The individual may discover capacities for leadership, sensuality, or spiritual power that were completely hidden during their former existence. What looks like breakdown from the outside may actually be breakthrough from the perspective of the soul's deeper agenda. But these gifts come wrapped in such chaos that they are difficult to unwrap cleanly. The creativity may be brilliant but destructive. The leadership may be powerful but misdirected. The spiritual experiences may be genuine but contaminated by ego inflation. The individual finds themselves in possession of new capacities they lack the wisdom to use skillfully, like a child given adult tools without adult understanding. The integration of shadow material, the process by which rejected aspects of personality are consciously acknowledged and incorporated into a more complete sense of self, requires time, patience, and usually guidance from someone who has successfully navigated similar territory. But in premature shadow embrace, these resources are often unavailable. The individual is alone with forces they cannot understand, possessing capacities they cannot control, experiencing truths they cannot integrate. This aloneness is compounded by the fact that most people in the individual's life have never undergone such an experience themselves and therefore cannot offer meaningful support. Friends and family, operating from their own unexamined relationship with their shadows, often respond with fear, judgment, or attempts at control that only intensify the chaos. Professional helpers, unless they have done their own deep shadow work, may pathologize experiences that are actually part of a natural but accelerated individuation process. The shadow's embrace in the context of violent awakening thus becomes not just a personal crisis, but a social one. The individual finds themselves isolated not only from their former sense of self, but from their community, their support systems, and often their means of livelihood. They become strangers in their own life, refugees from a way of being they can no longer inhabit, but have not yet learned to transcend. As this phase of the process deepens, the individual often begins to experience a peculiar form of identity confusion that transcends simple uncertainty about preferences or values. They may feel as if they are hosting multiple personalities, each with its own desires, opinions, and ways of relating to the world. In the morning, they may feel like a mystic seeking union with the divine. By afternoon, they may feel like a hedonist pursuing pleasure at any cost. By evening, they may feel like a warrior preparing for battle against cosmic forces of evil. These multiple selves are not separate personalities in the clinical sense, but rather different archetypal configurations that the ego, weakened by violent awakening and dissolution, lacks the strength to synthesize into a coherent whole. The individual becomes a theater in which various archetypal dramas are played out, but there is no director to coordinate the performances, no script to provide overall meaning, no audience capable of making sense of the spectacle. In this archetypal chaos lies both the greatest danger and the greatest opportunity of shadow embrace. The danger is that the individual will become completely identified with one or another of these archetypal patterns, losing themselves in roles that are larger than any human being can successfully inhabit for long. The opportunity is that they will learn to recognize these as temporary costumes rather than permanent identities, and in doing so, begin to develop relationship with the transcendent center that Jung called the self. But such recognition requires a level of conscious development that is often precisely what has been compromised by the violent awakening process. The individual needs to be simultaneously strong enough to engage with archetypal energies without being possessed by them, and humble enough to serve purposes larger than their personal agenda. This combination of strength and humility is rarely available to someone whose ego structure has been shattered and whose familiar self has dissolved. The premature embrace of shadow material thus sets up conditions for what often becomes the next phase of the violent awakening process, the inflation of the mystic ego. having discovered that they are not who they thought they were, having encountered aspects of their nature that transcend ordinary human limitations. The individual often makes the mistake of identifying with the transcendent rather than learning to serve it. The shadow's gifts become the foundation for a new form of ego inflation that is in some ways even more dangerous than the ordinary ego it replaces. For now, though, in the midst of shadow embrace, such future developments remain hidden. The individual is fully occupied with the immediate challenge of surviving the encounter with their own rejected nature, of finding some way to be in relationship with aspects of themselves they never wanted to acknowledge. They are learning, through direct and often painful experience, that wholeness cannot be achieved through the exclusion of any part of themselves, no matter how uncomfortable or socially unacceptable those parts might be. This learning, though brutal in its immediacy, carries within it the seeds of authentic transformation, for it is only by meeting the shadow as it actually is, rather than as we imagine it to be, that we can begin to discover what it means to be fully human rather than merely good, complete rather than just acceptable, whole rather than simply pure. The shadow's premature embrace, for all its chaos and pain, offers the possibility of a kind of completeness that can never be achieved through spiritual bypassing or moral perfectionism. But first, before such integration can occur, the individual must navigate the treacherous waters of archetypal inflation that so often follow the discovery of transpersonal dimensions within themselves. The ego, having been humbled by dissolution and shadow encounter, often attempts to rebuild itself on a cosmic scale, identifying with spiritual energies that no individual consciousness can safely contain. There is a moment in the journey of awakening when the soul, having tasted the nectar of the infinite, becomes drunk on its own transformation. It is here, in this intoxicating threshold between the ordinary and the sacred, that a most cunning deception takes root, one so subtle, so seductive in its golden robes, that even the most sincere seeker may find themselves ensnared in its luminous web. You have touched something vast, something that trembles at the edges of human comprehension, and in that touching you have been touched in return. The boundaries that once seemed so solid, between self and world, between human and divine, between the personal and the transpersonal, have become permeable, gossamer-thin veils that flutter in the breath of eternity. And yet, in this very permeability, a new form of solidity begins to crystallize, a new prison built not of iron bars, but of golden light. This is the birth of the mystic ego, that peculiar offspring of genuine spiritual experience and unconscious identification. It emerges not from the darkness of ignorance, but from the very brilliance of insight, not from the absence of the divine, but from its overwhelming presence. Like Icarus, ascending toward the sun, the soul becomes so enamored with its newfound altitude that it forgets the wax and feathers that make its flight possible, mistaking temporary transcendence for permanent transformation. Listen closely to the whisper that begins to form in the depths of your being. I have seen what others have not seen. I have touched what others have not touched. I am chosen. I am different. I am awake while the world sleeps. Can you hear it? This voice that speaks with such conviction, such luminous certainty. It wears the robes of truth, speaks the language of the sacred, and yet carries within it the seed of a new and more subtle form of separation. The mystic ego is perhaps the most sophisticated defense mechanism the psyche can construct, for it uses the very language of transcendence to maintain the illusion of specialness. It takes the genuine experience of unity and transforms it into a badge of superiority. It takes the authentic encounter with the numinous and fashions from it a crown of enlightenment. Where once there was the humble dissolution of boundaries, now there emerges a new boundary between the awakened and the unawakened, between those who see and those who remain blind. Consider how this inflation manifests in the theater of your inner world. You have perhaps experienced moments of profound clarity, instances where the veils parted and reality revealed itself in all its interconnected magnificence. In those moments, the small self that worried about mundane concerns, that struggled with petty anxieties and ordinary desires, seemed to dissolve entirely. You were no longer the person who paid bills and navigated traffic and felt lonely on Sunday afternoons. You were something vast, something eternal, something that touched the very source of existence itself. But then comes the return, the inevitable descent from the peak experience back into the valley of ordinary consciousness. And here, in this liminal space between transcendence and immanence, the mystic ego begins to weave its golden thread. Instead of integrating the experience as a temporary glimpse of your deeper nature, the ego identifies with it completely. Instead of understanding the peak as a gift that comes and goes like the tide, it claims ownership of the ocean itself. "I am enlightened," whispers this golden voice. "I have achieved what takes lifetimes to achieve. I have broken free from the illusions that bind ordinary humanity." And with each whisper, the prison walls grow higher, built not of stone, but of light itself. The very experiences that were meant to humble the ego, to reveal its constructed nature, become instead the materials for an even more elaborate construction, the enlightened self-image. This is the great paradox of spiritual inflation. It uses authentic spiritual experiences to reinforce the very sense of separate selfhood that those experiences initially dissolved. It takes the nectar of unity and ferments it into the wine of specialness. The mystic ego becomes intoxicated on its own holiness, drunk on its own transcendence, and in this intoxication, it loses touch with the very humanity it claims to have, transcended. Watch how this inflation affects your relationship to others. Where once you might have felt kinship with fellow travelers on the path, now you find yourself subtly, or not so subtly, categorizing people based on their level of awakeness. There are those who get it and those who don't. Those who are conscious and those who remain asleep. Those who speak your new spiritual language and those who are still trapped in the mundane concerns of ordinary existence. The mystic ego develops an exquisite sensitivity to what it perceives as lower vibrations. It finds itself unable to tolerate what it sees as unconsciousness in others. Their concerns seem trivial, their conversations shallow, their preoccupations beneath the notice of one who has touched the eternal. There emerges a kind of spiritual claustrophobia, a sense of being trapped among those who simply cannot understand the heights you have scaled. And yet, paradoxically, this very superiority becomes a new form of unconsciousness. The mystic ego, in its inflation, loses touch with the compassionate understanding that authentic awakening brings. It forgets that consciousness is not a possession to be hoarded, but a light to be shared. It overlooks the profound truth that genuine realization naturally expresses itself as humility, not arrogance, as inclusivity, not exclusivity, as love, not judgment. Consider how this plays out in the realm of spiritual community. The inflated mystic ego seeks out others who will reflect back its specialness, who will confirm its elevated status. It gravitates toward teachers and teachings that reinforce its sense of being chosen, of being part of an elite group of awakened beings. It begins to speak in the arcane language of spiritual attainment, using words like vibration and consciousness and awakening as talismans of its enlightened state. But notice how this language, which once served to describe genuine experiences of transcendence, begins to calcify into a kind of spiritual jargon. The words lose their luminous quality and become instead markers of tribal identity. The mystic ego learns to perform enlightenment rather than embody it, to speak about consciousness rather than simply be conscious, to describe love rather than love unconditionally. This performance becomes increasingly elaborate as the inflation deepens. The mystic ego begins to interpret every experience through the lens of its specialness. Synchronicities become personal messages from the universe. Dreams become prophetic visions. Intuitive insights become divine revelations. The ordinary world transforms into a theater where the cosmic drama of the ego's enlightenment plays out in vivid detail. And here we encounter one of the most insidious aspects of mystic inflation: its ability to co-opt genuine spiritual phenomena for the purposes of ego aggrandizement. The universe, it seems, conspires to confirm the ego's specialness. Signs and omens appear everywhere, all pointing to the same conclusion: that you are indeed chosen, indeed different, indeed operating on a higher level of reality than those around you. The mystic ego develops an elaborate interpretive framework that can transform any experience into evidence of its enlightened state. Challenges become tests designed to strengthen its spiritual resolve. Conflicts become opportunities to practice advanced forgiveness. Even failures become signs of the ego death that precedes rebirth. Every experience, whether pleasant or painful, becomes grist for the mill of spiritual narcissism. But perhaps most tragically, this inflation creates a profound disconnection from the very source that initially nourished the soul's awakening. The mystic ego, in its grandiosity, begins to believe that it has captured the infinite, that it has somehow contained the uncontainable within the boundaries of its enlightened self-image. It mistakes the finger pointing at the moon for the moon itself, the map for the territory, the experience of God for God itself. This is the golden prison that Jung warned us about, the inflation that comes not from identifying with the personal ego, but with archetypal energies themselves. The mystic ego doesn't simply think it's special. It believes itself to be a vessel of the divine, a channel of cosmic consciousness, an embodiment of universal love. And in this belief, it becomes perhaps even more trapped than the ordinary ego it claims to have transcended. The personal ego, at least, knows its limitations. It understands that it is small, finite, subject to the laws of cause and effect. But the inflated mystic ego believes itself to be beyond such limitations. It imagines itself to be in direct communication with the source of all existence. It fancies itself enlightened, not just in moments of peak experience, but as a permanent state of being. And so the soul, which began its journey in authentic wonder and humility, finds itself imprisoned in a cage of its own holiness. The very experiences that were meant to liberate it from the tyranny of the ego become instead the foundation for a new and more sophisticated tyranny. The mystic ego rules not through force, but through the gentle manipulation of spiritual superiority, not through obvious domination, but through the subtle assumption of enlightened authority. This inflation affects every aspect of the seeker's life. Relationships become opportunities to play the role of spiritual teacher or guide. Conversations become chances to drop pearls of wisdom and demonstrate advanced understanding. Even solitude becomes a kind of performance, a demonstration of the deep communion with the divine that others simply cannot access. The mystic ego begins to curate its experience, selecting only those aspects of reality that confirm its enlightened state while unconsciously filtering out anything that might challenge its grandiose self-image. It becomes increasingly sensitive to what it perceives as spiritual materialism in others, while remaining blind to its own subtle forms of spiritual consumerism. Consider how this manifests in the realm of practice. The inflated mystic ego approaches meditation not as a humble return to presence, but as a confirmation of its advanced spiritual status. It doesn't sit in simple awareness. It sits in the awareness of its own awareness, constantly monitoring its state of consciousness for signs of its continuing enlightenment. Prayer becomes not a surrender to the mystery but a dialogue between equals, a conversation between the soul and the divine that assumes a level of spiritual achievement. Even acts of service, which should naturally flow from genuine realization, become tainted by the subtle aroma of spiritual pride. The mystic ego serves not from spontaneous compassion, but from the position of one who has achieved the wisdom to know that service is the path. It gives not from overflow, but from the performance of giving. It loves not from the natural abundance of an open heart, but from the enlightened understanding that love is the highest vibration. And yet, and this is crucial to understand, none of this inflation is necessarily conscious or intentional. The mystic ego doesn't deliberately set out to become grandiose or superior. It genuinely believes in its own transformation. It sincerely thinks it has transcended the petty concerns of the unawakened masses. It authentically feels connected to something vast and sacred. The tragedy is not in the falseness of these experiences, but in the unconscious identification with them. This is why mystic inflation can be so difficult to recognize and even more difficult to address. It uses the very language of humility to express its arrogance, the very concepts of surrender to maintain its control, the very experiences of transcendence to reinforce its sense of specialness. It becomes a kind of spiritual gaslighting, where the soul convinces itself that its inflation is actually deflation, that its arrogance is actually humility, that its separation is actually unity. The mystic ego becomes particularly adept at spiritual bypassing, using spiritual concepts and experiences to avoid dealing with unresolved psychological material. Instead of facing the ordinary human work of healing trauma, developing emotional intelligence, and learning to love imperfectly, it leaps over these developmental tasks and claims to have transcended them entirely. "I am beyond such concerns," it declares. "I operate from a higher perspective where such mundane matters are irrelevant." But the unconscious material that remains unintegrated doesn't simply disappear because of spiritual experiences. Instead, it begins to express itself through the very spirituality that is meant to bypass it. The mystic ego's grandiosity becomes a compensation for deep-seated feelings of unworthiness. Its claims of universal love mask an inability to love specific people in specific circumstances. Its transcendent perspective becomes a way of avoiding the messy, imperfect work of being human. This is where Jung's insight into the shadow becomes particularly relevant. The mystic ego, in its identification with light, love, and consciousness, creates an even deeper shadow than the ordinary ego. All the quality it has disowned, doubt, anger, selfishness, pettiness, ordinary human needs, don't disappear, but instead get projected onto others or buried so deeply in the unconscious that they begin to operate autonomously. The inflated mystic ego may speak eloquently about compassion while harboring subtle contempt for those it sees as less evolved. It may preach about unity while maintaining rigid boundaries between the spiritual and the mundane. It may advocate for surrender while unconsciously controlling every aspect of its spiritual image. The very virtues it claims to embody become the shadows it cannot see. And so we arrive at one of the most profound paradoxes of the spiritual journey. The experiences that are meant to humble the ego can become the very foundation for its most sophisticated inflation. The glimpses of the infinite that should reveal the constructed nature of the separate self become instead the raw materials for building an even more elaborate spiritual identity. The taste of freedom becomes the addiction to the idea of being free. This is not to diminish the value of genuine spiritual experience or to suggest that all claims of awakening are merely ego inflation. Rather, it is to point to the incredible subtlety with which the ego can co-opt even the most authentic moments of transcendence for its own purposes. It is to highlight the ongoing vigilance required to distinguish between genuine realization and spiritual inflation. The mystic ego is particularly cunning because it uses truth to serve falsehood. It takes accurate insights about the nature of reality and transforms them into possessions of the enlightened self. It uses authentic experiences of the sacred to build a more refined but equally imprisoning sense of identity. It speaks the language of the divine while serving the agenda of separation. Consider how this inflation affects the mystic ego's relationship to suffering. Having touched states of consciousness beyond ordinary pain and pleasure, it begins to develop an aversion to its own remaining humanity. It becomes intolerant of its own moments of sadness, anger, or confusion, seeing these as signs of spiritual failure rather than natural expressions of the human condition. It begins to bypass its own emotional life, seeking always to transcend rather than integrate, to rise above rather than dive deep. This creates a kind of spiritual dissociation, where the soul hovers above its own experience rather than fully inhabiting it. The mystic ego learns to witness its life rather than live it, to observe its humanity rather than embrace it. It develops a subtle but persistent sense of being above it all, beyond it all, more evolved than the messy business of actually being human. And in this hovering, this persistent transcendence, the soul loses touch with the very ground from which genuine spirituality springs. It forgets that the sacred is not separate from the mundane but hidden within it. It overlooks the truth that enlightenment is not an escape from humanity, but the full embrace of what it means to be human. It misses the profound understanding that the divine is found not by transcending the ordinary, but by discovering the extraordinary within the ordinary. The inflated mystic ego begins to live in a kind of spiritual bubble, surrounded by concepts and experiences that confirm its enlightened state while insulated from the feedback that might burst that bubble. It seeks out communities of like-minded souls who speak the same spiritual language and share the same transcendent aspirations. It immerses itself in teachings that validate its elevated perspective and confirm its advanced understanding. But this bubble, for all its luminous beauty, becomes a prison as surely as any cage of iron bars. The mystic ego, in its inflation, loses the capacity for genuine surprise, for authentic encounter, for the kind of not knowing that keeps the heart open and the mind flexible. It begins to interpret every experience through its established framework of enlightenment, seeing only what confirms its existing understanding while filtering out anything that might challenge or deepen it. This is perhaps the most tragic aspect of mystic inflation. It stops the journey precisely when it should be accelerating. The ego, having tasted the nectar of transcendence, believes it has arrived at its destination, when in fact it has only begun to explore the territory. It mistakes the first glimpse of the mountain peak for the completion of the climb. It confuses the opening of the door with walking through it. The genuine spiritual path, as Jung understood so clearly, is not a linear progression from ignorance to enlightenment, but a spiral dance of integration and transcendence, of expansion and contraction, of ego death and ego rebirth. But the inflated mystic ego wants to bypass this dance, to claim the prize without paying the price, to have the enlightenment without the ongoing work of becoming enlightened. And so it creates a kind of spiritual plateau, a comfortable resting place where it can enjoy the view of its own achievement without the continued challenge of growth. It develops elaborate explanations for why it doesn't need to go any deeper, why it has already achieved what others are still seeking, why its current level of realization is sufficient for its needs. But the unconscious, that vast and wise realm, beyond the ego's control, is not so easily satisfied. It continues to send dreams, symptoms, and synchronicities that point to the unfinished business of integration. It creates circumstances that challenge the ego's inflated self-image, and invite a more humble and authentic engagement with the mystery of existence. The mystic ego, however, has become skilled at interpreting these challenges as tests of its spiritual resolve rather than invitations to deeper honesty. It transforms every crisis into a spiritual lesson, every failure into a teaching about non-attachment, every criticism into an opportunity to practice forgiveness. While these interpretations may contain truth, they also serve to maintain the ego's defensive structure, preventing the kind of genuine vulnerability that allows for continued growth. This is where the wisdom of Jung's approach to individuation becomes particularly relevant. Jung understood that the spiritual journey is not about transcending the ego, but about right-sizing it, not about eliminating the personality, but about discovering the self that lies beyond, but also includes the personality. The inflated mystic, ego in its grandiosity, misses this crucial distinction. It believes that having big spiritual experiences makes it a big spiritual person, that touching the infinite makes it infinitely significant. But genuine realization tends to have the opposite effect. The more deeply we touch the source of existence, the more we understand our own relative insignificance in the grand scheme of things. The more we experience unity consciousness, the less need we have to claim it as our personal achievement. The more we embody love, the less we need to announce our loving nature to the world. The mystic ego, however, operates from the opposite principle. The more it experiences, the more special it feels. The more it realizes, the more it needs to demonstrate that realization. The more it loves, the more it needs recognition for its loving nature. It becomes caught in a kind of spiritual materialism where experiences of the sacred become possessions to be accumulated and displayed rather than gifts to be received and shared. This materialism expresses itself in subtle but unmistakable ways. The mystic ego begins to collect spiritual experiences like trophies, seeking ever more dramatic and exotic states of consciousness. It develops a kind of peak addiction, always chasing the next high, the next breakthrough, the next confirmation of its advanced status. It begins to measure its progress by the intensity of its experiences rather than by the integration of its insights. The ego also becomes increasingly concerned with its spiritual reputation. It wants to be known as awakened, recognized as enlightened, acknowledged as wise. It begins to curate its public image, sharing only those aspects of its experience that confirm its elevated status while hiding the messy, uncertain, still very human aspects of its journey. It develops a kind of spiritual persona, a carefully constructed image of enlightenment that it presents to the world. But perhaps most significantly, the inflated mystic ego loses touch with the beginner's mind that is so essential to genuine spiritual growth. It believes it already knows what it needs to know, has already experienced what it needs to experience, has already achieved what it set out to achieve. It stops being curious about its own unconscious material, stops being open to feedback from others, stops being willing to have its understanding challenged or deepened. This knowing becomes a kind of spiritual blindness. The mystic ego sees only what confirms its existing framework, while remaining unconscious of vast areas of potential growth and integration. It becomes particularly blind to its own shadow, those aspects of itself that don't fit the enlightened self-image it has constructed. These shadow elements don't disappear, but instead get projected onto others or acted out unconsciously in ways that contradict the ego's stated values. The inflated mystic ego may preach about non-judgment while harboring subtle contempt for those it sees as unconscious. It may advocate for authenticity while living from a carefully constructed spiritual persona. It may speak about surrender while maintaining rigid control over its image and reputation. These contradictions are invisible to the ego itself, but often painfully obvious to others. This blindness to its own shadow creates a kind of spiritual stagnation, The mystic ego, convinced of its own enlightenment, stops doing the deep psychological work that genuine transformation requires. It believes it has transcended the need for such mundane concerns as healing childhood wounds, developing emotional intelligence, or learning to love imperfectly in relationship with others. But the unconscious material that remains unintegrated continues to influence behavior in unconscious ways. The mystic ego may find itself inexplicably triggered by certain people or situations, reacting with anger or defensiveness in ways that contradict its enlightened self-image. Rather than seeing these reactions as invitations to deeper self-examination, it tends to rationalize them as spiritual tests or projections from others. This rationalization becomes another layer of the ego's defensive structure. Every challenge to its enlightened self-image becomes evidence of others' unconsciousness rather than an opportunity for its own growth. Every criticism becomes a projection rather than potential feedback. Every failure becomes a teaching about non-attachment rather than information about areas needing attention. And so the mystic ego becomes trapped in a self-reinforcing loop of spiritual superiority. The very experiences that should humble it become instead confirmation of its specialness. The very insights that should open it to deeper mystery become instead possessions of its enlightened identity. The very love that should dissolve all boundaries becomes instead a marker of its advanced evolutionary status. This is the golden prison that Jung warned us about, beautiful, luminous, and absolutely confining. The bars are made not of metal, but of light itself, not of obvious delusions, but of subtle identifications with archetypal energies. The mystic ego becomes imprisoned by its own holiness, trapped by its own transcendence, confined by its own claims of freedom. But here is where hope enters the story. For just as the original ego served an important function in psychological development before becoming a limitation that needed to be transcended, so too does the mystic ego serve a purpose before revealing its own limitations. The inflation, for all its problems, often represents the psyche's attempt to integrate powerful archetypal energies that have been activated by genuine spiritual experience. The challenge is not to eliminate the mystic ego, but to see through its grandiosity to the authentic spiritual impulse that lies beneath it. The task is not to deny the reality of transcendent experience, but to hold it more lightly, to let it flow through us rather than claiming ownership of it. The invitation is not to avoid the archetypal realm, but to relate to it with appropriate humility and respect. This requires what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold the tension between opposing forces within the psyche, rather than identifying exclusively with one side or the other. In this case, it means learning to honor both the transcendent experiences that have opened us to new dimensions of reality and the ordinary humanity that remains our foundation for authentic living. The deflation of the mystic ego is not a fall from grace but a return to grace. It is the recognition that our true nature is not found in our peak experiences, but in the aware presence that witnesses all experiences. It is the understanding that enlightenment is not a possession to be claimed, but a reality to be embodied, not a state to be achieved, but a recognition of what has always already been true. This deflation often comes through what Jung called enantiodromia, the tendency of things to turn into their opposites when they become too extreme. The inflated mystic ego, in its grandiosity, eventually encounters experiences that puncture its balloon of specialness. These may come through external challenges, internal crises, or simply the natural maturation that comes with sustained spiritual practice. Whatever form it takes, this deflation is ultimately a gift, though it rarely feels like one at the time. It offers the opportunity to rediscover the genuine humility and wonder that mark authentic spiritual realization. It invites a return to the beginner's mind that is so essential for continued growth. It opens the door to a more integrated and sustainable relationship with the sacred dimensions of existence. The journey through and beyond mystic inflation is not a once-and-for-all achievement, but an ongoing process of refinement and integration. The ego's tendency toward inflation is not eliminated, but rather recognized and worked with more consciously. The seeker learns to notice the subtle signs of spiritual pride before they crystallize into full-blown grandiosity. They develop the capacity to hold transcendent experiences lightly, appreciating their beauty without claiming ownership of them. This is the mature spirituality that Jung pointed toward, not the transcendence of the human condition, but its full embrace, not the elimination of the ego, but its right-sizing, not the avoidance of the shadow, but its integration into a more complete and authentic wholeness. It is a spirituality that includes both the peaks and valleys of human experience, both the mystical and the mundane, both the divine and the human dimensions of our being. The deflated mystic ego discovers that true enlightenment is not about being special, but about recognizing the specialness that pervades all existence. It is not about rising above humanity, but about diving more deeply into what it means to be human. It is not about transcending love, but about learning to love more inclusively, more humbly, more authentically. And in this discovery, the golden prison finally dissolves, not because the light disappears, but because the bars are recognized to have been made of light all along. The same light that shines in every being, the same consciousness that animates all life, the same love that holds the entire universe in its embrace. The mystic ego's specialness is revealed to be the specialness of existence itself, and in that recognition, true freedom is finally found. There comes a moment in the soul's journey when the very ground beneath your feet, not the physical earth, but the invisible foundation upon which your entire world of meaning rests, begins to crumble like ancient parchment touched by flame. You have built your life upon certain truths, certain certainties that seemed as solid as stone cathedrals, as enduring as mountain ranges. Yet now, in this terrible hour of reckoning, you discover that what you took for granite was merely sand, and the tide of awakening consciousness washes it all away with ruthless indifference. The collapse does not announce itself with trumpets or dramatic revelations. It begins as a whisper, a small crack in the wall of your constructed reality. Perhaps it starts with a question that refuses to be silenced. But what if this isn't true? The question, innocent as a child's inquiry, carries within it the seed of destruction for entire cosmologies of belief. You try to silence it, to patch the crack with familiar reassurances, but questions breed questions, and doubt, once born, grows with the hunger of a wildfire. The religious frameworks that once provided you with cosmic orientation, those magnificent architectures of meaning that told you who you are, where you came from, and where you're going, begin to feel hollow, like empty theaters where no play is being performed. The prayers that once lifted your spirit now taste like ash in your mouth. The rituals that once connected you to the sacred now seem like elaborate performances with no audience, no meaning, no divine presence watching from the wings. You find yourself going through the motions, hoping to recapture what has slipped away, but the more desperately you grasp, the more completely it dissolves between your fingers. This is not mere intellectual skepticism, that comfortable academic exercise where one questions beliefs from the safety of the mind's observatory. This is a visceral dissolution, a felt experience of watching your entire universe become transparent, revealing the void that was always there, hidden behind the elaborate tapestries of meaning you had woven around yourself. It is as if you had been living in a beautiful painted room, and now the paint is peeling away to reveal blank, indifferent walls. The philosophical systems you once embraced with the fervor of a convert, those elegant theories that promised to explain the mystery of existence, now reveal themselves as elaborate intellectual constructions, no more connected to ultimate truth than a child's sandcastle is connected to the ocean that will inevitably reclaim it. The great thinkers whose words once illuminated your path now seem like voices calling from a great distance, their insights muffled by the growing awareness that all human understanding is merely a candle flame held against the infinite darkness of the unknown. You realize, with a horror that penetrates to the very marrow of your being, that you have been living in a house of cards, and the slightest breath of authentic questioning brings the whole structure tumbling down. The values that once guided your choices, those moral compasses that pointed toward what you believed was true north, spin wildly now, finding no magnetic field to anchor them. Right and wrong, good and evil, sacred and profane, all these distinctions that once carved up reality into manageable portions now blur together like watercolors in the rain. This is the wasteland T.S. Eliot spoke of, but experienced not as poetic metaphor, but as lived reality. You walk through the landscape of your former beliefs like a survivor wandering through the ruins of a once great city, seeing everywhere the broken columns and shattered statuary of a civilization that no longer exists. The gods have fled, leaving behind only empty temples where the wind whistles through broken windows and dust gathers on abandoned altars. The personal mythology you had crafted about your own life, that coherent narrative that explained your struggles, your victories, your very identity, unravels like a poorly woven tapestry. The story you told yourself about who you are and why you are here begins to feel like a fairy tale told by someone else, a fiction you had somehow convinced yourself was biography. You look in the mirror and see a stranger, a character from a novel you can no longer remember writing. In this desolate landscape, even the simplest human experiences lose their savor. Love becomes a chemical reaction, beauty becomes an evolutionary accident, and death becomes mere biological cessation. The sunset that once moved you to tears now registers as nothing more than the scattering of light through atmospheric particles. The embrace of a loved one becomes a behavioral pattern designed to ensure genetic survival. The joy of creation becomes a neurochemical reward for activities that once helped the species thrive. You find yourself in what the mystics called the dark night of the soul. But this darkness is not the pregnant darkness of the womb or the fertile darkness of rich soil. This is the darkness of the void, the absence of all light, all meaning, all purpose. It is a darkness so complete that even despair seems too rich an emotion to sustain. There is only a grey flatness, an existential anesthesia that makes every moment feel like swimming through thick grey water toward no particular shore. The speed of this collapse is what makes it so devastating. Had these structures of meaning eroded slowly over years or decades, the psyche might have had time to adapt, to find new foundations upon which to rebuild. But when awakening comes too quickly, when the veils are torn away with sudden violence, consciousness finds itself naked and shivering in a universe that offers no shelter, no warmth, no explanation for its own existence. You become like a person who has lived their entire life in a house and suddenly finds themselves standing in an empty field with no memory of how the house disappeared or where they might find another. The familiar landmarks by which you navigated your life have vanished, leaving you without compass or map in a territory that seems to stretch endlessly in all directions, offering no path forward and no way back to the certainty you once knew. This is the terrible democracy of meaninglessness, where all beliefs, all values, all truths become equally suspect, equally hollow, equally incapable of providing the solid ground upon which a human life can be built. The profound becomes trivial, the sacred becomes secular, and the eternal becomes merely temporal. You are a refugee from your own former world, carrying nothing but the memory of a paradise you can no longer believe ever truly existed. In this wasteland, the very capacity for meaning-making seems to have been surgically removed from your consciousness. It is not that you can find no meaning, It is that meaning itself has become an impossibility, a human construct as arbitrary and artificial as the clothes we wear or the languages we speak. You look upon the meaning-making activities of others, their passionate commitments, their fervent beliefs, their confident assertions about truth and purpose, with the detached bewilderment of an anthropologist studying the rituals of a tribe, whose customs seem utterly foreign and inexplicable. The irony is cruel. You sought truth, and truth has revealed itself to be the absence of all the truths you once cherished. You sought awakening, and awakening has delivered you into a consciousness so clear, so unfiltered, so free of illusion, that it can no longer generate the beautiful lies that make human existence bearable. You have become too awake for comfort, too conscious for consolation, too aware for the blissful ignorance that once provided shelter from the storm of existence. Yet this collapse, devastating as it feels, is not the end of the story. In the mythology of transformation, the wasteland is not the final destination but a necessary passage. The old meanings had to die, not because they were entirely false, but because they had become rigid, unconscious, inherited rather than lived. They were like clothes that no longer fit, constraining rather than protecting the growing soul. But in the midst of the collapse, this understanding provides little comfort. You are like Dante in the dark wood, having lost the straight path, surrounded by wild beasts and unable to find your way toward the mountain of salvation. The guide who will eventually appear, that wise figure who will lead you through the depths and eventually toward the light, has not yet arrived. For now, there is only the darkness, the confusion, and the terrible freedom of a consciousness no longer bound by any external authority or inherited wisdom. The collapse of meaning-making is both curse and blessing, destruction and liberation. It strips away the false consolations that prevented deeper searching, the comfortable certainties that kept the soul from its necessary journey into the unknown territories of itself. But this knowledge comes later, as cold comfort to the one who stands in the ruins of everything they once held sacred, watching the last embers of their former world fade into ash and darkness. In this place of no meaning, you discover that the human soul has a remarkable capacity to exist in suspension, to breathe the thin air of uncertainty, to walk the narrow bridge between the no longer and the not yet. You learn that consciousness itself is more resilient than any of the contents of consciousness, more durable than any of the meanings it can create or destroy. You begin to understand that you are not the meanings you make, but the one who makes. Meanings and who can survive their dissolution. The wasteland teaches its own lessons, harsh though they may be. It shows you that life can continue even when stripped of all the narrative frameworks that once made it seem significant. It reveals that existence itself, naked of all interpretation, contains a strange and terrible beauty, the beauty of pure being, unconditioned by story or symbol or significance. It is a beauty too austere for human comfort, too vast for human comprehension, but it is real in a way that all your former meanings were not. And so you learn to walk in the wasteland, to breathe its thin air, to navigate by stars that cast no light and offer no guidance. You become intimate with emptiness, fluent in the language of absence, at home in the house of no meaning. This is your preparation for what is to come, for the return of meaning that will be deeper and more authentic, because it arises not from inheritance or convention, but from the direct encounter with the void that gives birth to all significance. When the carefully constructed barriers of ordinary consciousness suddenly give way, what rushes through is not the gentle stream of enlightened awareness that spiritual seekers often imagine, but a torrential flood of archetypal energies that have been held in check by the very structures now dissolving. You have become like a dam that has cracked under pressure, and through that crack pours the accumulated power of the collective unconscious. Ancient gods and forgotten goddesses, primordial patterns and mythic forces that your small personal consciousness was never designed to contain. These are not metaphors or poetic imaginings. They are autonomous psychic realities that possess a power and intelligence that dwarfs the ego's capacity for understanding or control. They arrive uninvited and unannounced, like divine guests who have decided to take up residence in a cottage built for one. Your consciousness, that modest dwelling you had thought sufficient for your needs, suddenly finds itself host to energies that require palaces, to forces that demand temples, to powers that have been worshipped and feared since humanity first learned to tremble before the numinous. The Great Mother comes first, perhaps, in all her terrible magnificence, not the gentle, nurturing mother of greeting cards and Sunday sermons, but the primal feminine force that both creates and devours, that gives birth and destroys with equal cosmic indifference. She fills your awareness like a tide of dark honey, thick with the mysteries of blood and birth, death and renewal. You feel her presence in your bones, in the deep cellular memory that connects you to the first woman who ever held a child to her breast or keened over the grave of the beloved. But your personal consciousness, trained in the narrow corridors of rational thought and conditioned response, has no framework for containing such vastness. The Great Mother overflows the boundaries of your individual psychology like wine poured into a teacup. Where once you were a person with particular preferences and opinions, now you are possessed by an archetypal force that has its own agenda, its own needs, its own ancient wisdom that operates according to laws your rational mind cannot fathom. You might find yourself compelled to behaviors that feel foreign to your ordinary personality, speaking in voices not your own, moved by impulses that seem to arise from geological depths within your psyche. The careful social persona you have cultivated over decades of living becomes as insubstantial as smoke in a hurricane. You are no longer the author of your own actions, but rather the vessel through which something immeasurably older and more powerful expresses itself. Then comes the wise old man, perhaps, with his penetrating gaze that seems to see through the veils of time and space, through the illusions that normally protect consciousness from direct confrontation with ultimate reality. His presence brings with it libraries of forbidden knowledge, scrolls written in languages you have never learned but somehow understand, wisdom that cuts through the comfortable ambiguities of ordinary life with the precision of a surgical blade. But this wisdom is not gentle guidance offered at a pace your psyche can assimilate. It arrives like an avalanche of revelation, burying you under the weight of insights your consciousness is not prepared to integrate. You see too much, understand too deeply, perceive patterns and connections that reveal the terrible and wonderful truth about the nature of existence. Your mind, accustomed to processing information in manageable portions, staggers under the load of cosmic understanding that the wise old man brings. The trickster appears too, with his divine mischief and sacred chaos, turning your carefully ordered world upside down with laughter that echoes from the beginning of time. He reveals the cosmic joke hidden at the heart of all human seriousness, the divine comedy that makes all your struggles and sufferings simultaneously profound and absurd. Through his eyes, you see that existence itself is a kind of elaborate prank being played by the universe upon itself, a cosmic game of hide and seek where the seeker and the sought are one and the same. But the trickster's medicine is strong wine, and your consciousness drinks too deeply, too quickly. The boundaries between sacred and profane, between meaning and absurdity, dissolve entirely. You find yourself laughing at funerals and weeping at celebrations, seeing the tragic comedy and comic tragedy that permeates every moment of human existence. The social world becomes a theatre of the absurd, where everyone is playing roles they don't understand in a play, whose script was written by a mad god with a sense of humour too vast for human comprehension. Each archetypal encounter fragments your sense of coherent selfhood a little more. You are no longer one person but a multiplicity of characters, each possessed by a different god, each speaking with a different voice, each operating according to different laws and different truths. The psychological integration that normally allows for a sense of unified identity becomes impossible when consciousness is flooded with energies that demand complete possession, total surrender to their particular vision of reality. The warrior. Archetype storms through your psyche like an army conquering foreign territory, bringing with him the fierce joy of battle and the uncompromising clarity of purpose that knows only victory or death. Under his influence, you become a spiritual berserker, attacking every obstacle to enlightenment with a ferocity that recognizes no compromise, no middle ground, no gentle gradations of progress. You declare war on your own unconsciousness, on the sleeping world around you, on every form of ignorance and illusion, with a zeal that burns like napalm. But the warrior's energy, uncontained by wisdom or patience, becomes destructive rather than transformative. Relationships become battlefields, conversations become contests of spiritual superiority, and the tender process of inner growth becomes a violent campaign of psychological conquest. You burn bridges you may need later, alienate allies who could have supported your journey, and leave behind a wake of destruction that no amount of enlightenment can justify. The lover arrives with her intoxicating promise of union, of the dissolution, of all separation in the ecstasy of cosmic embrace. Through her eyes, everything becomes an object of infinite tenderness and desire. The world reveals its hidden beauty, its secret divinity, its aching longing for connection and completion. You fall in love with existence itself, with every blade of grass and grain of sand, with the terrible beauty of suffering and the exquisite joy of liberation. But this archetypal love is not the measured affection of human relationship. It is the overwhelming eros of the cosmos itself, the force that drives galaxies to dance around each other in spirals of mutual attraction. Your personal capacity for love becomes like a small container trying to hold an ocean. You overflow with undifferentiated affection that attaches itself inappropriately, that seeks union where boundary is needed, that confuses cosmic love with personal romance and spiritual connection with sexual desire. The magician comes bearing the keys to the kingdom of power, the secret knowledge that can bend reality to will, that can transform lead into gold and darkness into light. Under his influence, you discover abilities you never knew you possessed. Synchronicities cluster around you like iron filings around a magnet, and the ordinary world begins to respond to your thoughts and intentions with an immediacy that would terrify your former self. But power without wisdom is perhaps the most dangerous gift the unconscious can bestow. You become drunk on your own abilities, intoxicated by the discovery that consciousness can indeed influence reality in ways that challenge every assumption of materialistic philosophy. You begin to believe that you are the magician rather than the vessel through which magic flows, that you have mastered these forces rather than being temporarily possessed by them. The prophet archetype floods your awareness with visions of possible futures, with urgent messages about the fate of humanity, with cosmic truths that demand to be shared with a world that seems determined to ignore them. You become a conduit for revelation, a mouthpiece for the divine, burning with the need to warn and awaken and transform everyone around you. The future becomes as real as the present, and you live simultaneously in multiple timelines of possibility and consequence. But prophetic vision, ungrounded in practical wisdom, becomes a burden rather than a gift. You see too clearly the trajectories of destruction and renewal, the patterns that govern the rise and fall of civilizations, the inevitable consequences of humanity's choices. You become like Cassandra, cursed to see the truth but unable to communicate it in ways that others can hear. The weight of cosmic responsibility presses down upon your shoulders like a mountain, and you struggle beneath the burden of knowledge that no individual consciousness was meant to carry alone. Each archetypal possession brings its own reality, its own truth, its own urgent demands for expression and acknowledgement. You become a psychological battlefield where gods wage war for control of consciousness, where ancient forces compete for the right to shape your thoughts, your words, your actions. The unity of personality that allows for coherent function in the world fragments into a multiplicity of divine madnesses, each compelling in its own way, each offering a piece of ultimate truth while obscuring all the others. This is not the gentle unfoldment of spiritual development described in the gradual paths of traditional wisdom. This is psychological possession by numinous forces, a kind of divine madness that can illuminate or destroy depending on whether consciousness has the capacity to contain and integrate these overwhelming energies. You have become like the heroes of ancient myth, who were visited by gods, blessed and cursed in equal measure, granted powers that could either elevate you to the status of a divine human or shatter you into fragments that can never be reassembled. Tragedy is that each archetypal energy contains profound wisdom, authentic power, genuine healing potential. The Great Mother carries the keys to nurturing and renewal. The wise old man brings the gift of deep understanding. The warrior offers the strength needed for transformation. The lover provides the connection that heals all separation. But like medicine taken in massive overdoses, these gifts become poisons when they flood unprepared consciousness faster than it can metabolize their power. You find yourself oscillating wildly between different archetypal states. One moment, possessed by the warrior's fierce clarity, the next overwhelmed by the mother's oceanic compassion, then suddenly catapulted into the magician's realm of power and possibility. Each transition feels like dying and being reborn, like being dissolved and reconstituted according to entirely different principles of organization. The continuity of memory and personality that normally provides the thread connecting one moment to the next becomes frayed and torn by the violence of these transitions. In the mythology of spiritual development, there are always guardians at the threshold, wise figures who regulate the flow of archetypal energy, who ensure that consciousness receives only what it can handle, who provide the guidance necessary for safe passage through the realms of power. But in rapid awakening, these guardians are often bypassed or overwhelmed. The protective barriers that normally regulate the flow between conscious and unconscious are breached, and consciousness finds itself exposed to forces that can remake it entirely, for better or worse. The ancient traditions understood this danger. The mystery schools and esoteric orders, the shamanic initiations and monastic disciplines, all were designed to prepare consciousness gradually for contact with archetypal energies, to build the psychological strength and wisdom necessary to contain and integrate these forces constructively. They knew that the gods do not adjust their intensity to accommodate human limitations, that divine energies flow at divine intensity regardless of the vessel's capacity to contain them. But the modern seeker, often approaching these energies without proper preparation, without adequate support, without understanding of the psychological dynamics involved, becomes like someone who opens a fire hydrant expecting a gentle stream of refreshment. The force that emerges can knock them off their feet, can overwhelm their capacity to maintain balance and perspective, can flood their psychological landscape so completely that the familiar landmarks of personal identity disappear beneath the waters of archetypal possession. In this, the paradox of the flood, it brings both the water of life and the waters of destruction. Within these archetypal energies lie the keys to psychological healing, spiritual awakening, and creative transformation. But without the proper container, without the wisdom to channel and integrate these forces, they become agents of fragmentation rather than wholeness, of dissolution rather than resolution, of madness rather than illumination. The challenge is not to dam the flood, for these energies, once activated, cannot be simply shut off or ignored. The challenge is to become a container worthy of their power, to develop the psychological strength and flexibility necessary to dance with gods without losing your human grounding, to drink from the river of archetypal wisdom without drowning in its depths. But this understanding comes later, as hard-won wisdom earned through the difficult process of learning to navigate the flooded landscape of archetypal possession. For now, there is only the overwhelming immediacy of forces too vast for comprehension, too powerful for control, too sacred for anything but awestruck surrender to their terrible and wonderful reality. There comes a point in the journey of rapid awakening where the soul, intoxicated by its glimpses of the infinite, begins to view the finite world with something approaching disgust. The relationships that once nourished you, the responsibilities that once gave your life structure and meaning, the simple pleasures of embodied existence, all of these begin to feel like chains binding you to a lower order of reality, like heavy garments that must be shed before you can ascend to the luminous heights of pure consciousness. You have tasted the nectar of transcendence, and now ordinary honey seems cloying and artificial. You have seen the vast panorama of existence, from the mountain peak of expanded awareness, and the valley of everyday human experience appears cramped and shadowy by comparison. The people you once loved seem suddenly small and unconscious, trapped in their petty concerns and limited perspectives, like prisoners who have grown so accustomed to their cells that they mistake them for the entire universe. This is the seduction of the transcendent, the terrible beauty of infinity that makes everything finite appear worthless by comparison. You have become like someone who has spent years living by candlelight only to step suddenly into brilliant sunlight. Your eyes, adapted to the darkness, find the lesser illumination not merely inadequate, but actively painful to behold. The warm flicker that once provided comfort and guidance now seems to cast more shadows than light. Your marriage, perhaps, becomes the first casualty of this spiritual inflation. The person who once seemed to complete you now appears as an anchor, dragging you down into the depths of mundane concerns. Their needs for emotional connection, for shared domestic life, for the thousand small intimacies that weave two lives together, begin to feel like demands from a lower consciousness that refuses to understand your elevated state. You look upon their tears of confusion and abandonment with the detached compassion one might feel for a child crying over a broken toy, touching perhaps, but ultimately irrelevant to the vast cosmic drama unfolding within your consciousness. You begin to speak a different language, using words like attachment and ego and illusion to dismiss their pain as spiritual immaturity. When they plead for your presence, your attention, your love, you respond with teachings about non-attachment and the futility of clinging to form. You have become a spiritual teacher to someone who desperately needs a human partner, offering cosmic wisdom when what is required is simple earthly care. The children, if there are children, become symbols of the biological imperatives that once held you captive. Their laughter, which once lifted your heart like music, now seems to echo from a distant shore of consciousness you have left behind. Their needs for stability, for routine, for a parent who can be counted upon to exist fully in the shared reality of family life, feel like weights tied to your ankles as you attempt to soar into the stratosphere of spiritual realization. You tell yourself that you are modeling for them a higher way of being, that your detachment is actually a gift that will free them from the suffocating grip of conventional consciousness. But in truth, you have become like a parent who speaks to their children from behind a wall of glass, present but unreachable, visible but untouchable, physically there but psychologically absent in the realms where actual relationship occurs. Your friendships begin to wither like flowers in a drought. The conversations that once sparked with mutual interest and affection now feel tedious and superficial. When friends share their struggles with career disappointments or relationship conflicts, you find yourself offering profound spiritual insights about the illusory nature of success and the impermanence of all earthly bonds. Your well-meaning attempts to elevate their consciousness beyond their immediate concerns leave them feeling unheard and unmet, as if they had come seeking a drink of water, only to be offered a lecture on the molecular structure of H2O. You begin to attract a different circle of associates, fellow seekers who speak the same rarefied language of spiritual awakening, who understand the burden of being conscious in an unconscious world, who validate your growing sense that you have outgrown the limited perspective of ordinary humanity. Together, you create an echo chamber of transcendent superiority, reinforcing each other's belief that detachment from the material world is not only spiritually advanced, but morally superior to the messy entanglements of earthly love. Your work, if it involves anything less than the salvation of humanity or the advancement of consciousness, begins to feel like a betrayal of your true purpose. The practical details that keep the world running, paying bills, maintaining schedules, fulfilling obligations, become symbols of humanity's spiritual slavery. You may abandon responsibilities with the righteous conviction that you are refusing to participate in the collective delusion that keeps people trapped in unconsciousness. The irony is devastating. In your flight toward unity consciousness, you have become profoundly isolated. In your pursuit of universal love, you have severed the particular bonds that actually teach the heart how to love. In your quest for ultimate truth, you have dismissed as illusion the very experiences through which truth most commonly reveals itself to human beings. You have forgotten that the infinite expresses itself through the finite, that the eternal reveals itself in the temporal, that the absolute manifests itself in the relative. In your rush to embrace the transcendent dimension of reality, you have rejected the immanent dimension, the sacred presence that dwells within the ordinary, the divine that hides in plain sight within the apparently mundane experiences of daily life. This is spiritual bypassing in its most seductive form, not the crude avoidance of psychological work or emotional healing, but the sophisticated rejection of incarnation itself. You have become like the mythical figure who was granted the gift of flight but forgot that humans need to keep at least 1 foot on the ground to maintain their connection to the earth that feeds and sustains them. The body, your own physical form, begins to feel like a prison rather than a temple. Food becomes merely fuel for a biological machine, rather than a source of sensual pleasure and connection to the earth's abundance. Exercise becomes a chore required to maintain the vehicle, rather than a celebration of embodied vitality. Sleep becomes an annoying necessity that interrupts the flow of spiritual practice, rather than a nightly journey into the restorative mysteries of the unconscious. You may develop a kind of spiritual anorexia, rejecting not just food, but all forms of earthly nourishment, beauty, comfort, pleasure, touch, as signs of spiritual weakness or attachment to form. The body's needs for rest, for nutrition, for movement, for sensual engagement with the world are seen as demands from the ego that must be transcended through increasingly austere spiritual practices. Sexual intimacy, that most grounding and humanizing of experiences, becomes particularly problematic. The raw animal reality of physical desire feels incompatible with your elevated spiritual identity. You may reject sexuality entirely as a lower impulse that distracts from higher consciousness, or you may attempt to spiritualize it so completely that it loses its earthly power to connect two human beings in vulnerable, imperfect, beautifully flawed communion. The simple pleasures that once brought joy to your days, a good meal shared with friends, music that moves the body as well as the soul, the satisfaction of physical work well done, the comfort of familiar routines, all begin to feel like indulgences that the spiritually mature should outgrow. You develop a kind of cosmic snobbery that looks down upon such mundane satisfactions as evidence of humanity's failure to recognize its divine nature. Nature itself may become a problem, appreciated only for its symbolic value rather than its intrinsic reality. A sunset becomes a metaphor for the light of consciousness rather than a specific phenomenon to be experienced through the senses. A tree becomes a teaching about rootedness and growth rather than a living being with whom relationship is possible. You walk through the natural world like a tourist in a spiritual theme park, collecting insights and revelations, but missing the immediate presence that offers itself moment by moment to anyone willing to meet it with full attention. This detachment creates its own form of suffering, the loneliness of the person who has placed themselves beyond the reach of ordinary human comfort. You have become like someone living in a tower, able to see great distances, but cut off from the street-level interactions where life actually happens. Your expanded perspective comes at the cost of intimate connection, your cosmic consciousness purchased with the currency of human warmth. The tragedy deepens when you begin to experience this isolation as confirmation of your spiritual advancement. The fact that others cannot reach you in your elevated state becomes proof of their unconsciousness rather than evidence of your own disconnection. The loneliness you feel is interpreted as the natural consequence of outgrowing the need for external validation rather than the predictable result of severing the bonds that actually nourish the human soul. You may develop a martyr complex, seeing yourself as a spiritual pioneer who must endure the loneliness of advanced consciousness for the sake of humanity's eventual evolution. Your detachment becomes a noble sacrifice rather than a form of spiritual bypassing, your isolation a sign of your dedication to truth rather than an indication that you have lost your way in the very territory you claim to have mastered. Inafar, people you have left behind in your ascent to higher consciousness do not experience your detachment as spiritual advancement. They experience it as abandonment, as a form of death that is in some ways more painful than physical death, because the person they loved is still visible, but no longer truly present. They grieve for someone who is still alive but no longer accessible, still speaking, but in a language that no longer includes them in its vocabulary of concern. Your children, if they exist, may spend years trying to earn their way back into your attention by becoming spiritual seekers themselves, hoping that if they learn to speak your new language, you might return to the relationship they remember. Your partner may exhaust themselves attempting to meet you in the rarefied atmosphere of your transcendent state, not understanding that the altitude you have chosen cannot sustain ordinary human life. Meanwhile, the very experiences you have rejected in the name of spiritual purity continue to call to you from the depths of your being. The human need for connection, for touch, for shared laughter and shared sorrow, for the messy intimacy of imperfect love. These needs do not disappear simply because you have labeled them as attachments to be transcended. They go underground, into the shadow realm of disowned aspects of yourself, where they fester and grow distorted by neglect. You may find yourself secretly longing for the very things you have publicly rejected, creating a split between your spiritual identity and your human needs that generates its own form of psychological suffering. The part of you that hungers for simple human warmth becomes like a neglected child, acting out in ways that sabotage your efforts to maintain your transcendent composure. This is the cruel irony of premature detachment. The very bonds you sever, in the name of spiritual freedom, are often the ones that would have grounded and supported your continued growth. Relationship, rather than being the enemy of awakening, is often its most powerful catalyst. It is in the crucible of intimate connection that the ego's self-deceptions are most clearly revealed, that the heart's capacity for compassion is most deeply developed, that the abstract insights of spiritual practice are tested against the concrete demands of love. The earth you have rejected as too dense for your elevated consciousness is the very ground from which your spiritual tree must grow. Without roots in the soil of ordinary human experience, the branches of your transcendent realization may reach impressive heights, but will lack the stability to weather the storms that inevitably come to test every seeker's understanding. The responsibilities you have abandoned as spiritually irrelevant are often the disciplines through which genuine spiritual maturity is developed. The daily practice of showing up for others, of keeping commitments even when inspiration wanes, of caring for the practical details that sustain life. These mundane tasks are the gymnasium where the soul builds the strength necessary for authentic transformation. But in your flight from the finite, you have deprived yourself of the very experiences that could have taught you how the infinite expresses itself through limitation, how the absolute reveals itself through relationship, how the eternal manifests itself through time-bound commitment. You have become like someone who studies the theory of swimming while refusing to enter the water, convinced that getting wet would contaminate their understanding of the principles involved. The path back to wholeness, should you eventually choose to take it, will require a journey of re-embodiment that may be even more challenging than the original ascent into transcendent states. You will need to learn again the forgotten languages of the heart, to rebuild bridges you have burned, to descend from your tower of cosmic consciousness into the valley where actual humans live and love and struggle and grow. This descent is not a spiritual failure, but a necessary integration, not a fall from grace, but a return to the ground where grace can actually take root and flower. It is the journey from transcendence to immanence, from cosmic consciousness to embodied wisdom, from the abstract unity of spiritual experience to the lived unity that includes and transforms the world of form rather than rejecting it. But this understanding lies in the future, beyond the current intoxication with infinity that has led you to reject the very finite forms through which infinity seeks to know and express itself. For now, there is only the terrible loneliness of the seeker who has flown too high too fast, who has mistaken detachment for freedom, who has confused the rejection of form with the transcendence of limitation. In your flight toward the absolute, you have forgotten that the absolute is not elsewhere but right here, not in some transcendent realm beyond the world of form, but hidden within every particular manifestation of existence. The God you seek in the sky lives also in the earth. The love you pursue in cosmic consciousness dwells also in the human heart. The truth you chase in mystical experience reveals itself also in the patient, faithful tending of ordinary relationships and everyday responsibilities. The severing of earthly bonds undertaken in the name of spiritual advancement becomes its own form of spiritual crisis, a crisis that will eventually demand its own healing, its own integration, its own return to the wisdom that knows that heaven and earth are not separate realms, but different aspects of a single reality that can only be fully known by embracing both. There comes a time in the soul's journey when the familiar ground beneath your feet begins to crumble, when the very foundations of who you believed yourself to be start to shift and dissolve like sandcastles before the incoming tide. This is not the gentle awakening spoken of in spiritual literature, nor the blissful surrender promised by teachers of transcendence. This is something far more primal, far more terrifying, the ego's encounter with its own mortality, its own irrelevance, its own impending dissolution. You find yourself standing at the threshold of an abyss that seems to have no bottom, staring into a darkness so complete that even the memory of light begins to fade. The ego, that faithful companion who has narrated your life story, who has given meaning to your experiences, who has been the very center around which your entire sense of reality has revolved, suddenly finds itself dethroned, stripped of its authority, facing extinction. This is the dark night of the ego, not to be confused with the dark night of the soul that the mystics describe, for this is something altogether more fundamental, more threatening to the very core of what you have always taken yourself to be. The soul's dark night is a temporary obscuration of the divine light, a testing of faith, a purification through spiritual drought. But the ego's dark night is the dawning recognition that the ego itself, this narrator, this central organizing principle, this sense of being a separate self, may be nothing more than an elaborate construction, a house of cards built upon foundations of air. The terror that accompanies this recognition cannot be overstated. It is the terror of annihilation, not just of the body, but of the very sense of being someone at all. The ego looks into the approaching darkness and sees not transformation but obliteration, not rebirth but simple final death. Every fiber of its being rebels against this prospect, marshalling every defense mechanism, every survival strategy, every psychological resource it can muster in a desperate attempt to maintain its grip on existence. Watch how this manifests in the theater of your inner world. Suddenly, the spiritual practices that once brought comfort and expansion become sources of anxiety and terror. Meditation, which previously offered glimpses of peace and spaciousness, now feels like a descent into a void where the sense of self threatens to disappear entirely. Prayer transforms from communion with the divine into a desperate plea for the preservation of the ego's familiar boundaries. The very experiences that should signal progress on the spiritual path, moments of selflessness, glimpses of unity, dissolutions of the subject-object duality, become sources of profound distress. The ego, encountering these states, interprets them not as liberation, but as death, not as expansion, but as annihilation, not as coming home, but as losing its way entirely. This is the cruel irony of the ego's dark night. The closer you come to authentic awakening, the more intense. Intense becomes the ego's resistance. It is as if the ego possesses some instinctual knowledge that its days are numbered, that the very experiences you are seeking will ultimately render it obsolete. Like a cornered animal, it fights with a desperation born of the knowledge that this is its final stand. The psychological symptoms that emerge during this phase can be overwhelming in their intensity. Anxiety floods the system like a poison, not the ordinary worry about external circumstances, but an existential terror that seems to have no object and no remedy. You may find yourself awakening in the middle of the night drenched in sweat, gripped by a nameless dread that feels more threatening than any external danger you have ever faced. Depression settles over the consciousness like a heavy blanket. But this is not the depression of loss or disappointment that can be traced to specific causes. This is the depression that comes from the ego's dawning recognition that its entire project, the construction of a solid, permanent, separate sense of self, may be fundamentally flawed, ultimately impossible, perhaps even an elaborate delusion. The sense of identity that once seemed so solid, so reliable, so obviously true begins to fragment and dissolve. You look in the mirror and wonder who is looking back. You hear your own voice and question whose voice it is. You find yourself unable to answer the simple question, "Who am I?" without falling into a vertigo of uncertainty that seems to have no bottom. This fragmenting of identity is perhaps the most disorienting aspect of the ego's dark night. The stories you have told yourself about who you are, what your life means, where you are going, all of these narratives suddenly lose their power to convince. They feel hollow, constructed, no more substantial than characters in a dream from which you are slowly awakening. The ego, in its desperation, attempts to reassert its centrality through increasingly frantic means. It may throw itself into spiritual practices with renewed intensity, not from authentic longing, but from a desperate attempt to regain the sense of being someone who practices. It may seek out teachers and teachings that promise to restore the familiar boundaries of selfhood. It may even abandon the spiritual path entirely, fleeing back toward the seemingly solid ground of material concerns and worldly identifications. But here is the terrible truth. that the ego begins to suspect. There may be no going back. Once the process of dissolution has begun in earnest, once the cracks in the ego's fortress have been revealed, no amount of patching and reinforcing can restore the old sense of security. The ego finds itself in the position of a homeowner whose foundation has been undermined by a hidden earthquake. Even if the walls still stand, the knowledge of their instability makes it impossible to inhabit them with the old confidence. This is where the dark night becomes truly nightmarish. The ego cannot go forward without facing its own dissolution, and it cannot go back to the innocent unconsciousness of its former existence. It is trapped in a liminal space, suspended between being and non-being, between the familiar identity that no longer fits and an unknown future that feels like death itself. The alchemists understood this stage well, calling it the nigredo, the blackening, the putrefaction, the necessary decay that must precede any authentic transformation. But they also knew that this stage could not be rushed, could not be bypassed, could not be avoided through cleverness or good intentions. The nigredo has its own timing, its own rhythm, its own inexorable logic that operates according to laws, deeper than the ego's desires or fears. And yet in our impatience, in our spiritual ambition, in our very human desire to get on with the business of enlightenment, we often try to force our way through this dark passage. We interpret the ego's resistance as something to be overcome rather than something to be understood. We see its desperate clinging as an obstacle rather than as a natural and even necessary response to the prospect of its own dissolution. Forcing this spiritual violence against the ego's natural rhythms can extend the dark night indefinitely. Instead of the temporary blackening that precedes rebirth, it becomes a chronic condition, a kind of psychological purgatory, where the ego is neither fully alive nor completely dissolved, neither unconscious nor awakened, but trapped in a grey twilight of partial death that seems to have no end. Consider how this manifests in your relationship to the spiritual path itself. What once felt like a journey toward greater freedom and joy now feels like a march toward annihilation. The very goal you set out to achieve, awakening, enlightenment, self-realization, begins to seem like an elaborate form of suicide, a sophisticated method of self-destruction dressed up in spiritual language. The ego looks at the reports of enlightened beings and sees only evidence of successful ego death. It reads about the dissolution of the separate self and hears only confirmation of its worst fears. It contemplates the promises of liberation and wonders if liberation is simply a euphemism for extinction. This fear is not entirely unfounded. In a very real sense, awakening does represent the death of the ego as the central organizing principle of consciousness. The ego's terror is based on an accurate perception. It really is facing obsolescence. Its role as the narrator of experience, as the author of identity, as the center around which all experience revolves, really is coming to an end. But what the ego cannot see from its limited perspective is that its death is not the end of the story, but the beginning of a larger story. It cannot imagine that its dissolution might reveal not nothingness, but something infinitely more vast and authentic than its constructed sense of self. It cannot conceive that the void it fears might be pregnant with possibilities it has never dared to imagine. The ego's dark night is characterized by a profound sense of meaninglessness that pervades every aspect of existence. The activities that once brought satisfaction feel empty and pointless. The relationships that once provided identity and connection seem hollow and insubstantial. Even the spiritual practices that initiated this journey lose their appeal, becoming merely mechanical rituals performed by a self that no longer feels real. This meaninglessness is particularly acute because it cannot be resolved through the ego's usual strategies. You cannot think your way out of it, cannot achieve your way through it, cannot acquire or accomplish anything that will restore the old sense of purpose and direction. The very mechanisms the ego has always relied upon to create meaning, goal setting, storytelling, identity construction, are revealed to be the source of the problem rather than its solution. The ego finds itself in the position of an author whose pen has run out of ink, a storyteller whose voice has been taken away, a director whose movie set has been struck and whose actors have gone home. Without its familiar role as the creator of meaning, it feels utterly lost, utterly purposeless, utterly alone. This aloneness is another hallmark of the ego's dark night, a sense of isolation so complete that even in the presence of others, you feel fundamentally disconnected, fundamentally unable to make genuine contact. It is as if you are viewing life through a thick pane of glass that prevents any real intimacy or communion. Others seem to be living in a different world, a world where identity is solid and meaning is obvious and connection is possible. The ego interprets this isolation as evidence of its failure, its pathology, its fundamental brokenness. It begins to wonder if it has taken a wrong turn somewhere, if it has misunderstood the spiritual teachings, if it is uniquely unsuited for awakening. The very universality of the dark night, the fact that virtually everyone who pursues genuine transformation encounters this passage, remains invisible to an ego convinced of its own singular suffering. In its desperation, the ego may attempt to recreate the conditions that preceded its dissolution, hoping to return to a time when its existence felt secure and unquestionable. It may throw itself back into worldly pursuits, may seek to rebuild the very identifications it has spent years trying to transcend. But these attempts feel hollow and inauthentic, like trying to put on clothes that no longer fit. Alternatively, the ego may attempt to accelerate its own dissolution, hoping to get through the dark night more quickly by embracing its death with forced enthusiasm. But this too proves futile, for genuine dissolution cannot be willed or achieved. It can only be allowed. The more the ego tries to control its own death, the more it reinforces the very sense of control and agency that must ultimately be surrendered. This is where patience becomes not just a virtue, but a necessity. The dark night of the ego has its own organic timing that cannot be hurried or delayed, only endured. Like a fever that must run its course to burn out an infection, the ego's dissolution follows natural rhythms that are deeper than conscious intention or spiritual ambition, but patience, in the midst of existential terror, can feel like an impossible demand. How do you patiently endure what feels like dying? How do you wait peacefully for something that looks exactly like annihilation? How do you trust a process that seems designed to destroy everything you have ever been or hope to become? The answer lies in learning to distinguish between the ego and the awareness that witnesses the ego's experience. Even in the depths of the dark night, even in the midst of the most intense dissolution, there remains something that is aware of the experience, something that witnesses the ego's terror without being destroyed by it. This witnessing awareness is not affected by the ego's dissolution. Indeed, it is only when the ego begins to dissolve that this deeper awareness becomes apparent. But this recognition often comes only gradually, only through sustained attention to what remains constant even as everything else falls away. In the beginning, the ego's voice is so loud, its terror so overwhelming, that it drowns out the quiet presence that witnesses its drama. The ego is like a person screaming in a library, so focused on its own noise that it cannot hear the deeper silence that surrounds and contains it. Learning to attend to this witnessing presence is not a technique or a practice in the ordinary sense, but rather a kind of remembering, a return to something that has always been there but has been obscured by the ego's constant activity. It is like learning to notice the sky behind the clouds, the space between thoughts, the silence that makes sound possible. This witnessing awareness has a quality of impersonal compassion that the ego, in its personal suffering, finds difficult to access directly. It does not attempt to save the ego from its dissolution, but holds space for the entire process with infinite patience and understanding. It is like a mother who holds a feverish child, not trying to stop the fever, but simply being present with love and steadiness until it passes. As the ego begins to sense this deeper presence, its terror begins to be tempered by a kind of curious wonder. What is this awareness that remains unaffected by its dissolution? What is this presence that seems to welcome both the ego's existence and its disappearance with equal grace? What is this consciousness that is revealed when the ego's constant chattering finally begins to quiet? These questions cannot be answered conceptually. They can only be lived into, explored through direct experience, discovered through the very process that the ego has been resisting. The dark night begins to transform from a period of pure suffering into something more complex, a time of dying that is also a time of birth, a dissolution that is also a discovery, a darkness that is pregnant with an unimaginable light. But this transformation cannot be rushed or forced. The ego must be allowed to experience its terror fully, to exhaust its resistance completely, to discover through its own direct experience that its worst fears are both true and not true. True in that it really is dissolving, not true in that this dissolution is not the end of the story, but its beginning. The dark night of the ego is ultimately a passage, not a permanent condition. But it is a passage that must be traversed with infinite respect for its own timing and rhythm. Like winter, it serves an essential function in the larger cycle of transformation, creating the conditions necessary for new life to emerge. The barren landscape it creates is not a sign of failure, but of preparation, not evidence of death, but of the space needed for rebirth. When we understand the dark night in this way, as a necessary phase in the soul's journey, rather than as a problem to be solved, we can begin to relate to it differently. Instead of fighting against the ego's dissolution, we can learn to hold space for it. Instead of trying to preserve what is being dismantled, we can begin to trust the deeper intelligence that is orchestrating the deconstruction. This does not make the dark night easy or pleasant. It remains a profound challenge, a test of faith, a journey through territories where no map can guide us. But it does make it meaningful, purposeful, and ultimately bearable. The ego's death, when allowed to unfold naturally, becomes the doorway to a life more authentic and free than anything the ego could have constructed or maintained. In the deepest darkness of this night, when the ego's resistance has finally exhausted, itself and its terror has given way to a kind of empty surrender, something unprecedented begins to stir. It is not the return of the old ego, nor is it the arrival of some new and improved version of the separate self. It is something altogether different, the first faint stirring of a life that belongs not to the ego, but to the vastness that has been revealed in the ego's absence. This is the dawn that follows the dark night, not a return to the previous day, but the beginning of something entirely new, something that could never have been born without the death that preceded it. The ego's dark night, for all its terror and difficulty, proves to have been not the end of the story, but its most crucial chapter, not a detour from awakening, but its very heart. There comes a moment in the accelerated journey of awakening when the soul finds itself in possession of treasures it cannot spend, wielding keys to doors it cannot yet open. The mind, stretched beyond its natural capacity, becomes a vessel too small to contain the oceanic truths that pour through its fractured boundaries. This is the paradox of premature wisdom, a divine comedy where enlightenment and madness dance, together in the theater of consciousness, each wearing the other's mask. Imagine, if you will, a child's hands suddenly filled with the tools of a master craftsman. The hammer feels foreign, too heavy. The chisel cuts where it should caress. The vision is clear, crystal clear. But the hands that must manifest it tremble with inexperience. So it is with the soul that receives profound revelations before it has developed the psychological muscles to bear their weight. The insights arrive like lightning strikes, illuminating vast landscapes of truth. But the nervous system, unprepared for such voltage, convulses under the intensity. In the language of the alchemists, this is the stage where gold appears before the base metals have been properly purified. The prima materia, the raw stuff of the psyche, has not undergone the necessary dissolution, separation, and cleansing. What emerges is fool's gold, glittering with genuine radiance, yet brittle to the touch. The individual becomes intoxicated by the beauty of their own insights, mistaking the temporary illumination for permanent transformation. The ego, in its desperate attempt to maintain coherence, begins to identify with these transcendent experiences. "I have seen the truth," it declares. "I am enlightened. I am chosen. I am different." But this inflation is merely the ego's defense against its own dissolution. Unable to surrender to the vastness it has glimpsed, it tries to contain the infinite within the finite boundaries of personal identity. This is like trying to capture the ocean in a teacup. The container inevitably shatters. What follows is a form of spiritual schizophrenia, where the individual exists simultaneously in multiple realities that refuse to integrate. In one moment, they possess cosmic consciousness, understanding the interconnectedness of all things with crystalline clarity. In the next, they cannot navigate a simple social interaction without feeling like an alien studying human behavior from a great distance. The profound and the mundane exist in parallel dimensions within the same psyche, each invalidating the other's reality. The mystics of old understood this danger well. They spoke of the need for gradual preparation, of purification and strengthening before the great mysteries could be safely approached. The Sufi tradition speaks of the polishing of the heart, a slow, methodical process of removing the rust of ego and conditioning that must precede true vision. The yogic path outlines 8 limbs, beginning with ethical conduct and physical discipline, building a stable foundation before the more advanced practices of meditation and absorption. Even Christ spoke of not putting new wine into old wineskins, knowing that the container must be prepared for what it is meant to hold. But in our time of instant gratification, when spiritual techniques are consumed like fast food and enlightenment is marketed as a weekend workshop, many souls find themselves thrust into the deep waters of consciousness without having learned to swim in the shallows. They mistake peak experiences for permanent states, confusing temporary unity consciousness with integrated wisdom. The tragedy of premature wisdom is not that the insights are false. Often they are profoundly true, more real than the consensus reality we mistake for the only truth. The tragedy lies in the soul's inability to live from these truths, to embody them in the simple acts of daily existence. Knowledge without integration becomes a burden, a golden chain that binds the spirit to an impossible standard of perfection. Consider the individual who has experienced the dissolution of the separate self, who has touched the eternal source from which all consciousness springs. They return to ordinary life carrying this cosmic perspective, yet they must still wash dishes, pay bills, and navigate the complex dynamics of human relationships. The gap between what they know to be ultimately true and what they must temporarily embody for practical living creates a profound internal conflict. The world begins to feel like a theater where everyone is playing roles they have forgotten are merely costumes. The awakened individual sees through the illusion, but finds themselves trapped within it, unable to fully participate in the game, yet unable to leave the theater. They become like actors who have glimpsed the audience but must continue performing their part, knowing it is all pretense yet bound by the script of human existence. This split consciousness manifests in countless ways. There is the person who can discourse eloquently on the nature of love and unity while being unable to maintain intimate relationships. There is the one who understands the illusory nature of suffering while being tormented by depression and anxiety. There is the individual who has seen through the ego's machinations while being consumed by spiritual pride and judgment of those still asleep. The unconscious, in its wisdom, often responds to this predicament by creating what appears to be psychological illness. Depression settles like fog, forcing the inflated consciousness back to earth. Anxiety arises like an alarm system, signaling that the psyche is operating beyond its sustainable capacity. Relationships deteriorate not from lack of love, but from the impossibility of connecting authentically when one foot is in eternity and the other is struggling to find ground in time. This is the dark night of the premature awakening, not the classical dark night of the soul where the seeker yearns for divine union, but rather the torment of having tasted that union while lacking the psychological integration to digest it. It is the suffering of Prometheus, who stole fire from the gods but was bound to have his liver eternally devoured by an eagle, the price of possessing divine knowledge in a mortal frame. The individual in this state often becomes incomprehensible to others, and more tragically, to themselves. Their speech becomes filled with profound truths that sound like delusions to those who have not shared their experiences. They speak of unity while appearing deeply fragmented, of love while seeming emotionally unavailable, of peace while radiating profound agitation. The wisdom is genuine, but it exists in a realm separate from their psychological development. Like a beautiful symphony played on an out-of-tune instrument, family and friends witnessing this transformation often interpret it as mental illness. And in a sense, they are not wrong. The premature flooding of consciousness with transcendent content, without proper preparation and integration, does create a form of temporary madness. But it is a sacred madness, a divine intoxication that contains within it the seeds of genuine transformation, if properly tended. The great danger during this phase is the temptation to retreat entirely into the transcendent realm, rejecting the human dimension as inferior or illusory. This spiritual bypassing becomes a flight from the very integration work that would allow the wisdom to become embodied. The individual may abandon their relationships, their responsibilities, their very humanity in pursuit of a pure spirituality that exists only in the rarefied air of peak experiences. Yet the psyche, in its profound intelligence, continues to call the soul back to earth through symptoms and crises. The body rebels against neglect, demanding attention to its needs. Emotions surge up from the depths, refusing to be transcended prematurely. Relationships create friction, forcing the individual to confront their lack of integration. These are not obstacles to enlightenment, but rather the very means by which enlightenment becomes possible. The path forward from this predicament requires a fundamental shift in approach, from seeking more transcendent experiences to learning to metabolize the ones already received. It demands the humility to acknowledge that wisdom without embodiment is merely sophisticated ignorance. It requires the courage to descend from the mountaintop of pure consciousness back into the valley of human existence, where the real work of integration begins. This descent is often experienced as a profound loss, a falling from grace. The ego, which had briefly identified with cosmic consciousness, must now learn to function as a humble servant rather than the master of the universe. The intoxicating sense of being special, chosen, or enlightened must be sacrificed for the more modest goal of becoming psychologically whole. This sacrifice feels like a death, and in many ways it is. the death of the grandiose spiritual identity that arose from the initial awakening. But in this apparent descent lies the seed of genuine transformation. For only when the wisdom descends into the body, into the emotions, into the practical affairs of daily life, does it become truly useful. Only when the cosmic insights are translated into greater compassion, clearer boundaries, and more authentic relationships do they fulfill their evolutionary purpose. The individual must learn to become bilingual, speaking the language of eternity while functioning fluently in the dialect of time. They must develop the capacity to hold simultaneously the absolute truth of their cosmic nature and the relative truth of their human conditioning. This is the great work of integration, not choosing between heaven and earth, but learning to inhabit both realms with equal authenticity. The madness of premature wisdom, therefore, is not a permanent condition, but rather a transitional phase, a chrysalis state, where the old form of consciousness has dissolved, but the new form has not, yet stabilized. It is the chaos that precedes a new order, the darkness that comes before a more sustainable dawn. The key is not to resist this chaos, but to learn to navigate within it, to find one's footing on shifting ground while the deeper transformation continues its work beneath the surface of awareness. In time, with patience and proper guidance, the split between knowing and being begins to heal. The profound insights slowly descend from the realm of pure consciousness into the lived experience of embodied existence. The wisdom becomes less spectacular but more useful, less cosmic but more compassionate, less transcendent but more transformative. The individual learns to be ordinary in an extraordinary way, fully human and fully divine, not in the grandiose sense of ego inflation, but in the humble recognition that this paradox is the natural state of integrated consciousness. This is the ultimate resolution of premature wisdom's madness, not the elimination of the profound insights, but their translation into a life lived with greater love, wisdom, and authenticity. The fire of awakening, which initially threatened to consume the unprepared psyche, becomes the steady flame that warms both the individual and all those whose lives they touch. The journey from madness to integration is long and often painful, but it is also sacred. A pilgrimage from the heights of transcendent knowing to the depths of embodied wisdom, where the real treasures of transformation await discovery. In the aftermath of premature awakening, when the soul has tasted the nectar of infinite consciousness and finds itself unable to digest its sweetness, there emerges a longing so profound, so achingly human, that it catches the spirit by surprise. It is the hunger for the ordinary, a desperate yearning for the very simplicity that transcendence seemed to promise escape from. Like an exile who has wandered too far from home, the awakened consciousness begins to dream not of further enlightenment, but of the blessed ignorance of unexamined life. This hunger manifests first as whispers in the depths of expanded awareness. The individual who has glimpsed the cosmic dance of unity finds themselves longing for the days when a cup of coffee was simply a cup of coffee, not a meditation on impermanence and interconnectedness. They remember with nostalgic tenderness the time when conversations about weather felt meaningful rather than superficial, when worries about money seemed important rather than illusory, when falling in love was a simple surrender rather than a complex spiritual lesson about attachment and projection. There is something almost heartbreaking about this reversal of desire. The very consciousness that once strained toward transcendence now pulls backward, like a rubber band stretched too far, seeking the comfort of its natural resting place. The soul that has soared in the rarefied air of pure awareness begins to suffocate in its own vastness, craving the density and limitation that make breath possible. This hunger is not mere nostalgia, though it may appear so on the surface. It is the psyche's profound intelligence asserting itself, recognizing what the inflated spiritual ego cannot yet comprehend, that genuine transformation requires not the abandonment of human experience, but its full embrace. The ordinary world, with all its apparent limitations and illusions, contains within its very ordinariness the seeds of authentic awakening. But this truth can only be recognized by a consciousness that has learned to value the ground as much as the sky. Consider the individual who has experienced states of cosmic unity, who has dissolved into the infinite ocean of pure being. They return to find themselves unable to enjoy a simple meal without analyzing its metaphysical implications, unable to watch a movie without deconstructing its archetypal themes, unable to laugh at a joke without questioning the ego mechanisms behind humor. The spontaneous joy of unreflective existence has been replaced by the burden of perpetual meaning-making. Every moment becomes heavy with significance, every interaction a spiritual test. In this state, the awakened individual begins to observe others with a mixture of envy and incomprehension. They watch people engage in small talk about sports or television with genuine enthusiasm, and they feel like anthropologists studying an alien species. How do they find such pleasure in the trivial? How do they care so deeply about outcomes that are ultimately meaningless? How do they love so freely without constantly analyzing the impermanent nature of all relationships? The hunger grows deeper when the individual witnesses moments of pure, unconscious bliss in others, a child absorbed in play, lovers lost in each other's eyes, friends laughing together without any awareness of their temporary mortality. These scenes, which once might have seemed spiritually unaware, now appear as glimpses of a paradise lost. The very unconsciousness that awakening seemed to cure begins to look like a form of grace. This is the great paradox that emerges in the wake of too rapid spiritual opening. The realization that consciousness without integration can become its own form of prison. The individual who has awakened prematurely often finds themselves trapped between two worlds, unable to return to the innocent unconsciousness they once knew, yet unable to move forward into genuine embodied wisdom. They become like the mythical figure of Cassandra, cursed with accurate perception, but unable to communicate their truth in a way that others can receive. The hunger for the ordinary manifests in countless subtle ways. There is the longing to read a book for pure entertainment without extracting spiritual lessons from every page. There is the desire to worry about mundane problems, money, relationships, career, without immediately recognizing these concerns as ego attachments. There is the wish to experience emotional reactions naturally without the constant observer consciousness commenting on their impermanent nature. In relationships, this hunger becomes particularly poignant. The awakened individual watches others navigate love and conflict with passionate engagement, while they themselves feel like actors who have forgotten how to lose themselves in their roles. They remember what it felt like to argue about trivial matters with genuine conviction, to be swept away by romantic infatuation, to make plans for the future without the constant awareness of life's uncertainty. The very emotional messiness that awakening promised to transcend begins to look like authentic living. The hunger extends even to suffering itself. Strange as it may seem, there emerges a longing for the days when pain was simply pain, not a spiritual lesson about the nature of attachment. When heartbreak was just heartbreak, not an opportunity for ego dissolution. When anxiety was merely anxiety, not a signal to examine one's identification with thought. The individual begins to understand that unconscious suffering, while painful, has a purity and immediacy that conscious suffering often lacks. This reversal of values creates a profound identity crisis. The spiritual ego, which has built itself around being awakened, conscious, and evolved, suddenly finds itself yearning for the very unconsciousness it once disdained. This creates internal conflict and shame. How can one who has glimpsed enlightenment desire ignorance? How can consciousness that has expanded long to contract? How can awakening lead to the desire for sleep? The shame deepens when the individual attempts to share these feelings with others on the spiritual path. In communities where higher consciousness is prized above all else, admitting a hunger for ordinariness feels like heresy. The person may feel isolated in their longing, believing they are somehow failing spiritually by not embracing their expanded awareness with constant gratitude. They may judge themselves as weak or spiritually immature for wanting to return to simpler ways of being. Yet this hunger, properly understood, is not a spiritual failure, but a profound wisdom. It represents the psyche's recognition that authentic transformation cannot bypass the human dimension of existence. The soul is calling itself home to the very ground where real integration can occur. The ordinary world is not the opposite of the sacred. It is the only place where the sacred can be embodied and lived. The mystics and depth psychologists have long understood this truth. Carl Jung spoke of the necessity of carrying one's vision down into the realm of human relationships and practical existence. He warned against the inflation that comes from identifying with archetypal energies while remaining disconnected from one's personal humanity. The goal of individuation, he emphasized, is not to transcend the personal, but to integrate it with the transpersonal in a living synthesis. In the Hindu tradition, the concept of householder spirituality recognizes that enlightenment must be compatible with ordinary life responsibilities. The Bhagavad Gita's central teaching is precisely about finding the sacred within action, about maintaining spiritual awareness while fully engaging with worldly duties. Even Buddha, after his enlightenment, chose to spend 45 years teaching in the world rather than remaining absorbed in transcendent states. The hunger for the ordinary, therefore, is not a regression, but a progression, a movement toward a more mature and integrated form of consciousness. It represents the soul's readiness to bring its expanded awareness into the crucible of human existence, where it can be refined and embodied through the countless small encounters of daily life. This understanding begins to shift the individual's relationship to their longing. Instead of seeing the hunger for simplicity as a spiritual failing, they begin to recognize it as guidance toward their next phase of development. The desire to engage authentically with ordinary concerns becomes not an escape from awakening, but a deeper entry into it. The wish to love and worry and laugh and grieve without constant meta-awareness becomes the soul's invitation to embody its wisdom rather than simply possess it. The process of honoring this hunger requires tremendous courage, for it means dismantling the spiritual identity that has become a new form of ego. The individual must be willing to appear less evolved, less conscious, less enlightened to others who are still caught in the transcendence trap. They must risk being seen as having fallen from their previous heights of awareness in order to find their authentic ground. This descent is reminiscent of the alchemical process of mortificatio, the necessary death of inflated consciousness that allows for genuine transformation. Just as the king must be dethroned for the realm to be renewed, the spiritual ego must surrender its exalted position for authentic integration to occur. This death feels real and frightening, for it involves releasing an identity that has provided meaning and specialness. Yet as the individual begins to honor their hunger for the ordinary, something remarkable occurs. The simple pleasures of human existence, a shared meal, a good conversation, the satisfaction of completing mundane tasks, begin to reveal new depths of meaning. Not the imposed meaning of spiritual analysis, but the intrinsic meaning that emerges when awareness is fully present to whatever is arising. The cup of coffee becomes sacred not because it represents impermanence, but because it is perfect in its coffeeness. The conversation about weather becomes meaningful not because it symbolizes something deeper, but because it is a genuine moment of human connection. The worry about bills becomes valid, not as an ego attachment to be transcended, but as an expression of care for one's survival and security. This is the beginning of what might be called ordinary enlightenment, a state where consciousness is neither inflated with cosmic significance nor deflated into unconsciousness, but resting naturally in the middle ground of embodied awareness. It is awakening that has learned to walk on earth rather than float above it, awakening that can cook dinner and wash dishes and argue about politics and fall in love with the same authenticity it once brought to meditation and prayer. The hunger for the ordinary, properly honored, leads to a profound recognition that the spiritual path does not lead away from human existence, but deeper into it. The goal is not to transcend our humanity, but to inhabit it so fully that its divine nature becomes self-evident. This requires a fundamental shift from seeking peak experiences to finding the sacred in plateau experiences, from pursuing transcendence to embracing immanence. In this process, the individual begins to understand that their premature awakening, while initially disruptive, has served a purpose. It has shown them what lies beyond the ordinary, making it possible to return to the ordinary with new appreciation. Like the hero's journey in mythology, the soul had to leave home to appreciate what home truly offers. The transcendent experiences become not destinations in themselves, but initiations that prepare consciousness for a richer engagement with the world. The relationships that once seemed superficial begin to reveal their hidden depths. The work that once felt meaningless becomes an opportunity for service and creativity. The emotions that once seemed like obstacles to enlightenment become the very medium through which love flows into the world. The body, which transcendent states might have taught one to ignore, becomes recognized as the sacred vessel through which consciousness experiences itself. This return to the ordinary is not a return to sleep, though it may appear so to those still caught in the transcendence trap. It is awakening seasoned with wisdom, consciousness that has learned to disguise itself as simple human being. It is the fulfillment of the Zen, saying that before enlightenment one chops wood and carries water, and after enlightenment one chops wood and carries water. But the quality of chopping and carrying is forever transformed. The individual who learns to honor their hunger for the ordinary discovers that they have not lost their expanded awareness, but have found a sustainable container for it. They can still access transcendent states when appropriate, but they no longer need to live permanently in their intensity. They can appreciate cosmic truths without being crushed by their weight. They can love without losing themselves in projection, think without being trapped by thoughts, feel without drowning in emotions. Most importantly, they begin to radiate a different quality of presence, not the brittle intensity of someone trying to maintain an elevated state, but the warm accessibility of someone who has made peace with their humanity. Others feel safer in their presence because they sense no judgment of ordinariness, no implicit pressure to be more conscious or evolved. In paradox that characterizes all genuine spirituality, they become more helpful to others awakening by appearing less awakened themselves. This is the great secret hidden within the hunger for the ordinary, that it is the soul's way of calling itself home to the only place where authentic transformation can occur. The ordinary world, with all its apparent limitations and distractions, is not the enemy of awakening, but its final classroom. Here, in the midst of bills and relationships and bodily needs, consciousness learns to embody itself gracefully. Here, in the crucible of daily existence, the gold of wisdom is refined until it glows with the steady light of integrated being. The hunger itself, once honored and followed, reveals itself to be not a regression, but a maturation, not a falling from grace, but a landing in grace, not an escape from awakening, but an arrival at its most sustainable and beneficial expression. In learning to be ordinary in an extraordinary way, the soul completes the circle of its journey, returning to where it started, but seeing its home, as T.S. Eliot wrote, for the first time. The soul stands at the threshold of two worlds, neither fully belonging to the transcendent realm it has glimpsed, nor able to return to the innocent unconsciousness it once knew. This is the integration crisis, the monumental challenge of weaving peak experiences into the fabric of daily existence, when the awakening has occurred too rapidly for the psyche to digest. It is here that the rubber meets the road, where lofty insights must prove their worth in the mundane crucible of human relationships, work responsibilities, and the thousand small choices that comprise a life. The crisis begins with a profound sense of displacement, as if the individual has returned from a journey to a foreign country only to find that their own home has become alien territory. The same rooms, the same streets, the same people, yet everything feels surreal, like a stage set viewed from behind the scenes. The person who once moved through these spaces with unconscious familiarity now observes their own life with the detached bewilderment of an anthropologist studying an unfamiliar culture. This displacement is not merely philosophical, but viscerally felt. The body itself seems to have forgotten how to inhabit ordinary space. Simple tasks, making breakfast, driving to work, having a conversation with a neighbor, require conscious effort, as if the individual is learning to walk again after a long illness. The automatic pilot that once governed routine activities has been disrupted by the influx of cosmic consciousness, leaving the person to manually navigate experiences that were once effortless. The workplace becomes a particularly challenging arena for this integration struggle. How does one translate the experience of oceanic unity into answering emails? How does awareness of the illusory nature of the separate self coexist with competitive performance reviews? The individual finds themselves sitting in meetings, surrounded by colleagues who seem utterly absorbed in concerns that now appear transparently meaningless, yet they must somehow participate authentically in these interactions. The split between inner knowing and outer performance creates a profound exhaustion. It is the weariness of maintaining a perpetual translation between two incompatible languages, the language of transcendent truth and the dialect of consensual reality. Every conversation becomes an exercise in code switching, every task a negotiation between cosmic perspective and practical necessity. The individual begins to feel like a spy in their own life, pretending to care about things that their expanded awareness has revealed as ultimately insignificant. Relationships bear perhaps the heaviest burden of this integration crisis. Intimate. Partners, family members, and friends find themselves dealing with someone who looks familiar but speaks in riddles, who is physically present but emotionally unreachable. The person who once engaged passionately in the dramas of relationship now observes these dynamics with detached compassion, seeing through the ego games and emotional projections that once seemed so real and important. This shift in perspective, while potentially valuable, often manifests as emotional unavailability rather than wisdom. The awakened individual may interpret their partner's needs as ego attachments, their children's demands as opportunities to practice non-attachment, their friends' problems as illusions to be dissolved rather than genuinely held. What they mistake for spiritual maturity is often a sophisticated form of emotional bypassing, using transcendent insights to avoid the messy intimacy of human connection. The integration crisis reveals itself most painfully in the realm of love. The person who has experienced the absolute love of cosmic consciousness finds human love, with all its conditions, projections, and limitations, to feel small and confining. Yet they discover, often with horror, that they have lost the capacity for the very human love they now judge as inferior. They can speak beautifully about unconditional love while being unable to love their spouse unconditionally. They can discourse on compassion while feeling irritated by their children's ordinary needs. This creates a profound guilt and confusion. If enlightenment is supposed to make one more loving, why does intimate love feel more difficult than before? If awakening brings compassion, why does patience with others' unconsciousness seem harder to maintain? The individual begins to suspect that their spiritual experiences, rather than making them a better person, have somehow made them more judgmental, more isolated, more difficult to live with. The crisis deepens when the person attempts to share their insights with others. Family gatherings become exercises in restraint as they watch relatives engage in what they now see as unconscious patterns of behavior. They want to help, to share what they have learned, but their attempts at guidance often come across as condescending or incomprehensible. The truth they want to communicate is too large for the containers of ordinary conversation, and their efforts to compress infinite insights into finite words often result in misunderstanding or rejection. Professional life presents its own unique challenges. The individual who has glimpsed the meaninglessness of conventional achievement finds themselves unmotivated by career advancement, yet they still need to earn a living. The work that once provided identity and purpose now feels like an elaborate game of make-believe, yet they must somehow maintain performance standards while their heart is no longer invested in the outcomes. This disconnection from worldly motivation creates practical problems. Deadlines feel arbitrary when one has experienced timelessness. Competition seems absurd when one has touched the unity underlying apparent separation. The drive for success appears hollow when one has tasted fulfillment. That depends on nothing external. Yet bills must still be paid, responsibilities met, and professional relationships maintained. The integration crisis often manifests as a form of functional depression, not the clinical depression of chemical imbalance, but the existential depression of someone who has outgrown their life circumstances, yet lacks the tools to create new ones that accommodate their expanded awareness. They go through the motions of living, while feeling increasingly disconnected from the meaning that once animated these activities. Sleep becomes disrupted as the mind struggles to process experiences for which it has no adequate framework. Dreams become vivid and sometimes frightening as the unconscious attempts to integrate transpersonal content. The individual may experience periods of insomnia, lying awake in the dark hours, wrestling with questions that have no rational answers. How do I live normally when I have seen through the illusion of normality? How do I care about outcomes when I know all outcomes are temporary? How do I be human when I have remembered that I am so much more than human? The body, too, registers the integration struggle. The nervous system, overwhelmed by experiences it was not prepared to handle, may manifest symptoms of stress and exhaustion. The individual might experience unexplained physical ailments, digestive issues, or a general sense of not feeling at home in their physical form. The body has become a stranger, no longer the unquestioned vehicle of identity, but a mysterious vessel that must somehow accommodate both human limitations and cosmic awareness. Social interactions become increasingly difficult as the person struggles to find common ground with others who have not shared their experiences. Small talk feels impossibly superficial, yet attempts to engage in deeper conversation often leave others uncomfortable or confused. The individual begins to feel like they are speaking a foreign language, even when using familiar words. They may find themselves becoming increasingly isolated, not by choice, but by the growing gulf between their inner reality and the shared reality of their community. The crisis is compounded by the lack of adequate support systems for those undergoing integration challenges. Traditional therapy may feel inadequate when the problem is not psychological dysfunction, but the challenge of incorporating transcendent experiences into ordinary life. Spiritual communities may emphasize continued transcendence rather than Integration, inadvertently encouraging the very bypassing that prevents embodiment. Friends and family, however well-meaning, often cannot provide the understanding needed because they have no reference point for these experiences. This isolation can become a self-reinforcing cycle. The person feels misunderstood, so they withdraw further from social connection. The withdrawal increases their sense of alienation, which makes it even harder to relate to others. They may begin to see themselves as fundamentally different from ordinary people, not in an inflated way, but with a lonely recognition of their inability to fully participate in consensus reality. The integration crisis also reveals the shadow side of spiritual experiences, the ways in which transcendent insights can become new forms of ego identification. The individual may unconsciously use their awakening experiences as evidence of their specialness or superiority, even while consciously rejecting such notions. This spiritual narcissism operates beneath the radar of conscious awareness, manifesting as subtle condescension toward those who have not had similar experiences. The person in integration crisis often becomes their own harshest critic, judging themselves for their inability to seamlessly blend transcendent awareness with ordinary living. They may feel like they are failing at enlightenment, not realizing that the integration process itself is an essential part of authentic awakening. The struggle to embody their insights is not a sign of spiritual failure, but the necessary work of making transcendence relevant to immanent existence. Time becomes distorted during this crisis. The individual may feel suspended between past and future, unable to fully return to who they were, yet uncertain of who they are becoming. The linear progression of normal life gives way to a sense of being caught in a perpetual present that feels more like limbo than enlightened awareness. Plans for the future seem impossible when one's fundamental understanding of reality is still shifting. References to the past feel like discussing a different person's life. Yet within this crisis lies the seed of authentic transformation. The very difficulty of integration is what distinguishes genuine awakening from mere peak experiences. The struggle to live from expanded awareness in ordinary circumstances is the crucible in which wisdom is refined from raw insight. It is here that the difference between having profound experiences and becoming a profoundly transformed person is either bridged or revealed as an unbridgeable gulf. The integration crisis forces a fundamental question that cannot be avoided. Is enlightenment compatible with human life, or is it merely an escape from it? This question cannot be answered theoretically but must be lived into through the patient work of finding ways to honor both the transcendent and the immanent dimensions of existence. It requires developing what might be called embodied transcendence, awareness that is vast enough to hold cosmic truth, yet specific enough to navigate the particulars of human relationship. The resolution of this crisis, when it comes, does not arrive as a dramatic breakthrough, but as a gradual settling, like sediment in water that has been stirred by a great storm. The individual slowly learns to function with a kind of double vision, maintaining awareness of ultimate truth while engaging authentically with relative truth. They develop the capacity to be fully present to the ordinary concerns of life without losing touch with the extraordinary awareness that puts these concerns in cosmic perspective. This settling process requires tremendous patience and self-compassion. The person must learn to forgive themselves for their inability to instantly integrate transcendent insights into embodied wisdom. They must accept that authentic transformation is a long, slow process that cannot be rushed or forced. They must develop tolerance for the messiness of being simultaneously human and divine, limited and unlimited, individual and universal. The integration crisis, properly navigated, ultimately serves the soul's deepest purpose, not the inflation of the ego with spiritual experiences, but the gradual maturation of consciousness into a form that can serve both the individual's well-being and the well-being of the whole. It is the difference between being a mystic who escapes the world and being a mystic who transforms it through their presence and participation. It is the movement from spiritual experience to spiritual embodiment, from knowing the truth to becoming the truth in all its human complexity and divine simplicity. Like the phoenix learning to walk before it remembers how to soar, the soul begins its humble journey back to wholeness through the patient work of reconstruction. This is not the dramatic resurrection of myth and legend, but the quiet, methodical rebuilding of consciousness on foundations strong enough to support both human fragility and divine awareness. The return to wholeness after premature awakening requires a fundamental shift in approach, from seeking more transcendent experiences to learning to inhabit the expanded awareness already received with grace and groundedness. The beginning of this return is often marked by a profound exhaustion with the spiritual quest itself. The individual who has spent months or years trying to integrate peak experiences into daily life finally reaches a point of surrender. Not the transcendent surrender of ego to cosmos, but the humble surrender of the spiritual seeker to the simple necessity of being human. This surrender feels like defeat to the part of the psyche that has been striving for enlightenment, but it is actually the first step toward authentic transformation. In this surrender, something beautiful begins to emerge. The frantic energy that has been spent trying to maintain or recreate transcendent states slowly relaxes into a gentler awareness that simply observes what is present without needing to transform it into something more spiritual. The individual begins to notice that they can wash dishes without it being a mindfulness practice, can have conversations without extracting spiritual lessons, can feel emotions without immediately analyzing their impermanent nature. This shift represents a profound maturation of consciousness, the recognition that forcing integration is itself a form of violence against the psyche's natural rhythms. Just as a garden cannot be made to bloom through willpower alone, the soul's return to wholeness must unfold according to its own organic timing. The individual learns to trust this timing, even when it feels unbearably slow compared to the dramatic speed of their initial awakening. The rebuilding process begins with what might seem like regression, but is actually a necessary return to basics. Simple self-care becomes not a spiritual practice, but a practical necessity. Regular sleep, nourishing food, gentle exercise, time in nature, these fundamental human needs are no longer dismissed as unspiritual distractions, but embraced as the foundation upon which any sustainable awakening must rest. The body, which may have been neglected during the transcendent-seeking phase, is welcomed back as a wise teacher and trusted ally. Relationships, too, begin to shift as the individual learns to show up more authentically human rather than attempting to maintain a spiritually elevated persona. This often means disappointing those who had grown accustomed to the awakened person's cosmic perspectives and otherworldly detachment. Family and friends may be confused when the person who once spoke only of unity and transcendence begins expressing ordinary human emotions and concerns. But this apparent regression is actually a progression toward genuine intimacy and connection. The art of being present to another person's pain without immediately offering spiritual solutions becomes a crucial skill in this phase. Instead of responding to a friend's heartbreak with discourse on attachment and impermanence, the individual learns to simply listen, to hold space, to offer the healing presence of someone who has walked through their own darkness and emerged, not unscathed, but wiser. This is compassion in its most practical form, not the abstract loving-kindness of meditation, but the specific tenderness that emerges from shared vulnerability. In the workplace, the person begins to find ways to bring their expanded awareness to bear on ordinary tasks without making these tasks into spiritual performances. They discover that consciousness does not need to announce itself to be present, that awakened awareness can flow through the most mundane activities without calling attention to its presence. Excellence in work becomes not a spiritual practice, but a natural expression of care and attention. Relationships with colleagues develop greater authenticity as the individual stops trying to be special and starts being genuinely helpful. The relationship with the spiritual path itself undergoes a fundamental transformation during this phase. Books about enlightenment gather dust as lived experience becomes the primary teacher. Meditation, if practiced at all, becomes simpler and less goal-oriented. Perhaps just a few minutes of sitting quietly in the morning, not to achieve any state, but simply to check in with what is present. The individual may find themselves drawn to more embodied spiritual practices, gardening, cooking, walking, creative expression, activities that integrate awareness with action, rather than seeking to transcend the physical realm. This shift often includes a re-evaluation of spiritual teachers and communities that emphasize transcendence over integration. The person may find themselves feeling alienated from groups that celebrate peak experiences while offering little support for the challenging work of embodiment. They begin seeking out teachers and companions who understand that the real spiritual work happens not on the meditation cushion, but in the midst of ordinary life circumstances, in how one responds to traffic jams, treats service workers, and shows up for family responsibilities. The gradual return to wholeness includes learning to metabolize the spiritual insights already received, rather than seeking new ones. This is like the difference between constantly eating and actually digesting one's food. The individual begins to notice how their peak experiences have already changed them in subtle ways. Perhaps they are less reactive to criticism, more patient with delays, more able to find beauty in unexpected places. These changes are not dramatic or attention-getting, but they represent genuine transformation at the level of character and disposition. Sleep and dreams become important allies in this integration process. The unconscious, no longer flooded with transcendent content it cannot process, begins to offer more helpful guidance through dreams that feel practical rather than cosmic. The individual may dream of simple solutions to relationship conflicts, creative approaches to work challenges, or images that help them understand their own healing process. Sleep itself becomes restorative rather than a battleground between ordinary and non-ordinary states of consciousness. The process of rebuilding wholeness requires developing what might be called spiritual stamina, the ability to maintain awareness and compassion through the long hours of ordinary living rather than just during peak moments. This stamina is built gradually through thousands of small choices to remain present and kind in circumstances that would have previously triggered either transcendent escape or unconscious reaction. It is the difference between spiritual sprinting and spiritual marathoning, learning to pace oneself for the long journey rather than burning out in brief bursts of intensity. Humor returns during this phase, often surprising the individual who had become accustomed to taking everything with cosmic seriousness. They begin to laugh at their own spiritual pretensions, to see the absurdity in their former attempts to maintain perpetual enlightenment. This humor is not cynical but gentle, arising from the recognition that the human comedy includes even, especially, those who believe they have transcended it. The ability to laugh at oneself becomes a sign of genuine spiritual maturity rather than evidence of spiritual failure. The relationship with emotions undergoes a significant healing during the return to wholeness. Instead of trying to maintain equanimity in all circumstances, the individual learns to feel their feelings fully while not being overwhelmed by them. Anger, sadness, fear, and joy are welcomed as natural responses to life circumstances rather than problems to be solved or transcended. The person discovers that emotions, when met with presence rather than resistance, often carry important information and energy that support wise action in the world. This emotional integration often surprises those who expected awakening to eliminate negative emotions entirely. The individual may find themselves crying more readily, not from depression, but from a renewed capacity to be touched by life's beauty and poignancy. They may experience anger more cleanly, without the overlay of guilt about having spiritual reactions to injustice. Fear may arise more honestly, without the pretense that enlightened people don't worry about practical matters. The gradual return includes learning to trust one's own experience rather than constantly measuring it against spiritual ideals or other people's descriptions of awakening. The individual begins to recognize that their path is unique, that their integration process may look different from textbook descriptions of enlightenment. This trust in personal experience over external authority represents a crucial step toward spiritual maturity, the recognition that the ultimate teacher dwells within one's own lived experience rather than in books or lectures. Physical health often improves during this phase as the nervous system is no longer constantly overstimulated by transcendent experiences it cannot integrate. Chronic symptoms that may have emerged during the peak awakening period, insomnia, digestive issues, anxiety, often resolve naturally as the individual learns to live within their energetic means. The body becomes a trusted guide for what is sustainable rather than an obstacle to transcendence. Creative expression frequently becomes important during the return to wholeness. The individual may find themselves drawn to painting, writing, music, or crafts, activities that allow the integration of inner experience with outer form. This creativity is not necessarily about producing great art, but about finding tangible ways to express and ground the insights that have been received. The act of creation becomes a bridge between the transcendent and immanent dimensions of experience. The person's presence begins to change in subtle but profound ways during this phase. Instead of radiating the intense energy of someone trying to maintain an elevated state, they begin to embody a quality of settled awareness that feels safe and welcoming to others. People may find themselves naturally opening up in their presence, sensing someone who has been through their own fires and emerged not perfect, but genuinely human. This presence becomes a form of service that does not announce itself, but simply offers the gift of authentic being. Relationships deepen during this phase as the individual learns to love from a place of groundedness rather than transcendence. Instead of loving others from a cosmic perspective that sees beyond their human personality, they learn to love them precisely in their humanity, with all their flaws, limitations, and ordinary concerns. This shift often surprises intimate partners who had felt loved but not truly seen during the peak awakening phase. The work of rebuilding wholeness is not without its challenges. There are days when the individual feels they are losing their spiritual insights, when the expanded awareness seems to fade back into ordinary consciousness. These periods can trigger fear that they are regressing, that they are losing touch with the profound truths they have glimpsed. Learning to trust these natural rhythms, the expansion and contraction, the peaks and valleys of awareness, becomes an essential skill for long-term integration. The individual begins to understand that wholeness does not mean maintaining a constant state of elevated consciousness, but rather developing the capacity to access different states of awareness as circumstances require. Sometimes transcendent perspective is needed to navigate a crisis or make an important decision. Sometimes, ordinary human consciousness is more appropriate for connecting with a friend or completing a task. The art lies in learning to move fluidly between these states without attachment to any particular one. As the rebuilding progresses, the person may notice that their most profound spiritual experiences now come not through dramatic peak states, but through moments of simple presence, the way sunlight falls across a table, the feeling of genuine connection with another person, the satisfaction of work well done. These ordinary moments reveal themselves as no less sacred than the cosmic visions of earlier phases, and often more sustainable and nourishing. The return to wholeness ultimately reveals itself to be not a return at all, but an arrival. The arrival at a way of being that honors both the transcendent insights received and the human vessel that must carry them. It is the difference between being possessed by spiritual experiences and possessing them in the sense of making them truly one's own through embodiment. the individual learns to be both fully human and fully awake, not in alternation but simultaneously, creating a unique expression of enlightened humanity that serves both their own well-being and the well-being of all those whose lives they touch.